that the second part of last week's broadcast, the second part of the broadcast from the last weekend in July, as well as all of tonight's program, and good portions of the next several broadcasts are going to be going into the archives as Radio Free America program number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. What we're going to be doing this evening, and I'm going to go right into a rundown of what it is we're going to be hearing, because I have a lot of information to cover. We are going to begin by taking a look at an article from the San Francisco Chronicle yesterday. There was going to be a mock trial of Lee Harvey Oswald, and mock is the word here. Apparently a bunch of legal heavyweights, some of them I would say are going to be legal lightweights, at least in the most literal sense of the word. Some legal heavyweights are going to be attempting to assess whether or not Lee Harvey Oswald was guilty or innocent of the assassination of President Kennedy. That is rather like having a mock trial to determine whether or not the sun rises in the east. Oswald didn't kill anybody. The evidence is overwhelming, but there is going to be a mock trial about that, and I'm going to touch on this forthcoming bit of political theater to kick the broadcast off this evening. After that, I'm going to be reviewing some of the information that I presented last week, because there was a lot of information. We're going to be coming back to that this evening, and I want to underscore some of the points that were made. To begin with, we're going to review a piece by Anthony Kimmery, last name Kimery, in the current issue of Covert Action Information Bulletin. That is Covert Action Information Bulletin number 41. This concerns the apparent involvement of George Bush with the intelligence community and the CIA long before his official commencement of involvement with same. There are substantive indications, although not definitive, that George Bush may very well have been working for the U.S. intelligence community for many, many, many years. And specifically, we're going to take a look at the intersection between George Bush's work for the intelligence community, the CIA, and his work on behalf of the petroleum industry, because the petroleum industry and the intelligence community overlap to a tremendous extent. I'm going to be reviewing that article. It was read into the record almost in its entirety last week. After that, I'm going to be reviewing a section from a brilliant essay, a brilliant document, I should say, tragically unpublished, by Professor Peter Dale Scott of the University of California at Berkeley. The companion manuscripts, the first of them is called The Dallas Conspiracy, and the second one, a section of which I will begin reviewing, is called Government Documents and the JFK Assassination. Professor Scott is, in my opinion, one of the preeminent political intellects on the American scene today, and these two brilliant works, for my money, the two single best and most important printed sources on the assassination of President Kennedy and the political forces that performed that and what has happened since. Those documents are unpublished, but we're going to be going into those at considerable length this evening so that people can peruse some of the information. The only place that I know where people can get a hold of these documents is once again at Tom Davis Books. I will give the address for that. Tom Davis Books, P.O. Box 1107, Aptos, California, spelled A-P-T-O-S, zip code 95001-1107. That is the only place that I am aware of where you can get a hold of these particular documents. We're going to begin the sallying into government documents in the JFK assassination and the Dallas Conspiracy by reviewing the intersection between the petroleum industry and individuals like George de Mohrenschildt and others who spied on behalf of the Third Reich and then jumped to the U.S. intelligence community at the end of World War II. We're going to review them and their pivotal role in handling the Oswalds in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. I read that into this particular section of government documents in the JFK assassination into the record last week. Following that, I'm going to review and reread large sections of a long section of the Dallas Conspiracy that I read last week, this by way of underscoring some points and helping to fix them in the memories of the listeners. We're going to once again study the considerable degree of intersection between the petroleum industry, the intelligence community, and the Gehlen organization and related elements. The Gehlen organization is the Nazi Eastern Front spy outfit initially called Fremde Heere Ost, or Foreign Armies East, when it worked on behalf of the Third Reich. That was headed up by Nazi Major General Reinhard Gehlen, last name Gehlen. At the end of World War II, Reinhard Gehlen jumped to the United States with virtually his entire organization, plus a lot of intelligencers and SS people who had not worked on the Eastern Front originally. That organization then became, in turn, the CIA's Department of Russian and Eastern European Affairs, literally our eyes and ears on the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe during the Cold War. It then became the de facto NATO intelligence organization, and finally, it became the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, the West German, now the German intelligence service, which it is to this day. We're going to begin by reviewing long sections of that very important section of the Dallas conspiracy, and specifically we're going to see how this U.S. intelligence community Gehlen petroleum industry nexus handled the Oswalds in detail, and we're going to begin identifying some major political forces and methodology which were not only instrumental in the assassination of President Kennedy, but which also have wielded a profound influence on the world that has come out of the events of Dallas, Texas, from 11/22/63. In particular, I want to call people's attention to an organization called the NTS, or Solidarists, or National Toilers Alliance. This was a group of white Russians, Tsarists, opposed to the Bolshevik Revolution, who spied on behalf of Nazi Germany and provided a very, very important element of the Gehlen organization. They then jumped with Gehlen to the Central Intelligence Agency, and their methodology and tactical approach, namely attempting to and apparently successfully infiltrating the Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, and attempting, and apparently at least to a certain extent succeeding, in fomenting a mutiny on behalf of the Red Army. That is a major tactical and methodological consideration, and we will be, during the course of this very important Radio Free America show, we will be taking a look at just how that methodology evolved, beginning with the Third Reich, and jumping then to the CIA, and how it ultimately, in my opinion, came to its fruition in the events of August of 1991, when a failed coup, there was an attempted reactionary coup in the Soviet Union, but the military did indeed rebel. That sparked the end both of the Soviet Union and of the Communist Party, and at least for the time being, and apparently forever, the Cold War. By the way, I do not want to be misinterpreted by listeners, particularly new listeners, as holding a brief for the Soviet system or for its satellite governments in Eastern Europe. I most assuredly do not. I do have a considerable degree, as a student of military history, I do have a considerable degree of admiration for the bravery of the Soviet people and the Soviet armed forces during the Second World War. They were instrumental in defeating Adolf Hitler, at least for the time being. They also saved an awful lot of American lives, but I myself am something of a cynic. I have a very low opinion of human nature, and I've always viewed Marxism per se as a childish and ultimately doomed political doctrine. Basically, to make a long story short, Marxism depends for its theoretical success on perfect human beings, and there are no such things, and I think the failures that are inherent in the Marxist system are identical to the failures inherent in the notion of free market capitalism or supply-side economics. Both systems depend upon perfect human beings who will not take advantage of their superior power and superior position in society, and that just is at fundamental loggerheads with the basic dictates of human nature and the lessons of history as I see them. Just as there was no effective check upon the power of the Communist Party, the Politburo, and the Nomenklatura in the Soviet Union, so there is no effective check on the power of not only the multinational corporations in this country, but also the national security establishment itself, meaning the military and the intelligence services. Whenever you have unchecked, unbalanced power, you have the inevitable makings, in my opinion, for abuse. So I don't want to be misunderstood on that score, because we're going to be examining the assassination of President Kennedy, the role of elements of the Gehlen organization intersecting very heavily with U.S. intelligence and the petroleum industry. And remember that George Bush was part and parcel to this milieu. We're going to be examining that at considerable length this evening. Now, we're going to take a look at how these forces, which jumped to the United States, or were incorporated in the U.S. national security establishment at the end of World War II. We're going to take a look at how these forces were instrumental not only in ultimately defeating and breaking up the Soviet Union, but over the course of this entire Radio Free America show, we're going to take a look at how these forces subverted American democracy and have brought the American economy to its knees, and it is, unfortunately for all of us, on its knees. And this, in my opinion, and I will set forth the basis for this opinion during the course of this massive archive show, this, in my opinion, has signaled the end of the Second World War and the triumph of the Axis. Just as the full court strategy, which I delineated in Radio Free America number 36, helped to bankrupt that's the full court press strategy, just as it bankrupted the Soviet Union, so it has bankrupted the United States, and we're going to be taking a look at the overall process that was at work, in my opinion, and I will be setting forth again the documentary basis for that opinion. The single most important event in the second half of the 20th century was the assassination of President Kennedy. I do not think there is a great deal of importance in running around the grassy knoll, counting bullets and cartridge cases, or trying to figure out who the three tramps are or who the Umbrella Man was. I do think it's important for people to be familiar with the physical evidence in the case, so that when you see something like this mock trial that's coming up, you will realize just what a dog and pony show that really is. After reviewing that long section of the Dallas conspiracy, we're then going to jump back to the other brilliant document by Professor Scott, Government Documents and the JFK Assassination. This particular section of government documents in the JFK assassination is going to take a look at how the American far right, specifically some of the John Birch Society and Hunt family-related elements, again, deeply involved both with the petroleum industry and with the intelligence community, forged a very terrifying operational link with the same Galen anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations elements which we have been examining to date. Indeed, one of the important lessons of studying President Kennedy's assassination is to understand that a nexus, a milieu, and an explicitly fascist milieu was formed in which many of these Third Reich graduates, these Third Reich alumni, hooked up in a strong ideological and operational sense with the American far right, in particular elements associated with the defense industry and the petroleum industry, to form what is literally a fascist axis, and the operations of that axis intersecting not only with the petroleum industry but with the defense industry and the U.S. national security establishment has proved to be a decisive element, and we're going to be taking a look at how that element operated, some of the composite elements of that particular milieu, and how they have affected world history, both in the years leading up to November 22nd, 1963, and in the years coming out of it. We're going to be taking a look, as I said, at the Hunt family, their involvement with something called the ICDCC, that is a German-based intelligence network involving numerous Third Reich emigre. I read that quickly at the end of the broadcast last week. We're going to go into it at length and in detail this evening. Following that, we're going to take a look at this axis, this milieu, this operational and ideological hooking up of Third Reich alumni, such as the Galen Group and related elements like NTS, the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, about which I shall have more to say later. We're going to take a look at how they hooked up in the assassination of President Kennedy, and specifically, we're going to take a look at one of the most ludicrous of the many preposterous assertions by the Warren Commission, namely that Lee Harvey Oswald fired at former Army Major General Edwin Walker. Walker was fired by President Kennedy for teaching the John Birch, or requiring his troops to study the Blue Book of the John Birch Society, and we're going to take a look at the alleged shooting, Oswald's alleged shooting at General Edwin Walker, I should say, how absolutely ridiculous that is. And we're going to take a look at the forces which have shaped Marina Oswald's testimony, and we're going to take a look also at how the story of Oswald shooting at Edwin Walker, supposedly disclosed to the Warren Commission and FBI by Marina Oswald on December 3rd, in fact was relayed to a German neo-Nazi paper called the Deutsche Nationalzeitung und Soldatenzeitung, published by a fellow named Gerhard Frey. This was relayed to Gerhard Frey an associate and admirer of Edwin Walker, and the admiration was mutual, and it appeared in the Deutsche Nationalzeitung und Soldatenzeitung on November 29th, 1963. Now, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out that if this information was supposedly disclosed for the first time to the known world by Marina Oswald on December 3rd, but actually appeared in a German neo-Nazi paper days before that, obviously this indicates that there was something rotten in Denmark under the circumstances. We're also going to take a look at the ludicrous physical evidence being presented to bolster that untenable argument. Initially, all authorities who had examined it reported the bullet that supposedly was fired by Lee Harvey Oswald at Edwin Walker as a 7.65 millimeter Mauser, basically the 30-06 caliber converted to a NATO calibration. And we're going to take a look at how that mysteriously metamorphosed into a 6.5 millimeter Carcano round, this to implicate Lee Harvey Oswald. One of the people who helped to frame Marina Oswald's testimony vis-a-vis Oswald's alleged shooting at Walker was George de Mohrenschildt, a German spy, a colleague of George Bush, and a major operator in the petroleum industry. The other people who handled the Oswalds both before and after the assassination, Marina Oswald obviously being the only survivor of that couple, were people involved, again, with the Galen organization, White Russian and other Soviet nationalities that had emigrated to the United States under the auspices of Galen/CIA, and they were instrumental not only in handling the Oswalds, but in creating the story that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin. We're going to take a look, too, at the elements that Gerhard Frey and the Deutsche Nationalzeitung und Soldatenzeitung were affiliated with in Germany, and specifically we're going to begin looking at organizations like the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, people like Theodor Oberlander, a former SS man and a key liaison officer between the Galen organization and the White Russian Turncoat Army of General Andrei Vlasov. We're also going to be taking a look at organizations like the CIAS of a German intelligence veteran named Fritz Kramer. By the way, that's spelled C-R-A-M-E-R, and we're going to take a look at how these fascist elements in Germany, these Third Reich alumni, have hooked up, again, in an operational and ideological sense with the American far right, as exemplified by John Birch Society personalities such as the Hunt family and Major General Edwin Walker. After that, by the way, will come from the Dallas conspiracy. We are also going to take a look during the course of this particular examination at the Hunt family's operations vis-a-vis the assassination of John Kennedy. The Hunts have never been directly implicated in the assassination, and I want to underscore that, but their names have cropped up in connection with the investigation, and we're going to be taking a look at that. We're going to take a look at Jack Ruby's having visited the offices of Hunt family patron H.L. Haroldson Lafayette Hunt the day before Lee Harvey Oswald was shot, or perhaps it was the day before the assassination. When I go into the documentation, we will talk about that. We will also take a look at connecting links between Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby with Major General Edwin Walker. We're also going to take a look at how Nelson Bunker Hunt, one of H.L. Hunt's sons, was instrumental in paying for the black bordered ad in the Dallas Morning News that appeared on 11/22/63, accusing President Kennedy of treason. We will be looking at two books, Coincidence or Conspiracy by Bernard Fensterwald and High Treason by Robert Groden and Harrison Livingston for that particular information. After that, we're going to be taking a look at a long section, once again, of the Dallas conspiracy, and we're going to be taking a look at the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, a key element of what was to become the World Anti-Communist League. We're going to begin looking at the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations and related elements operations vis-a-vis the assassination of President Kennedy, how elements associated with this were involved with helping to traffic Lee Harvey Oswald and the Oswalds around in the United States, and we're going to take a very long look at the elements, I should say, that were involved in this particular milieu, and specifically we're going to be taking a look at an organization called the WACCFL. That's the World Anti-Communist Congress for Freedom and Liberation. That was the steering group which 4 years after the assassination of President Kennedy was to metamorphose or mature into the World Anti-Communist League, an organization which it may be familiar to many listeners as a key player in the Iran-Contra scandal. We're going to be taking a look at some of the component elements of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, the OUN-UPA, the Bandera organization, a Ukrainian fascist organization, which was a key element of the Gehlen organization during World War II, became a key element of the Gehlen organization when it jumped to the United States, and elements stemming from the OUN-UPA, specifically the RUK organization, spelled R-U-K-H, are the dominant element in the now independent Ukraine. Now, just as we are going to be examining the tactical and methodological operations of one Third Reich intelligence group, specifically the NTS, a white Russian group that worked with the Third Reich, we are also going to be taking a look at the operational goals of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations. The NTS, although opposed to Bolshevism and working with the Third Reich and later U.S. intelligence, did not want to see the physical breakup of the Soviet Union into its constituent ethnic republics. The anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, which, despite the fact that it was allied with the Third Reich, along with NTS and later the Gehlen organization, it was at loggerheads with the NTS and competed with it. Ultimately, the political goals, the operational goals of the ABN, namely the physical breakup of the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, into its constituent ethnic republics, well, of course, that has now been achieved. So two of the main elements that we're going to be looking at here are the tactical and practical operational methodology of the NTS, namely infiltrating the Soviet Army, and in particular the Soviet Military Intelligence Unit, the GRU, and fomenting a mutiny by the Soviet Armed Forces, and the operational goal of the ABN, namely to break the Soviet Union up into its constituent ethnic republics. That has now happened, and the vehicle for doing that was a mutiny within the Soviet Army in August of 1991, in which the Red Army, the Soviet Army, refused to follow the leaders of its, the orders, I should say, of its hardline communist leaders in attempting to overthrow Mikhail Gorbachev. We're going to be taking a look at how the ABN-related elements trafficked Lee Harvey Oswald around. We will take a look at the possibility that the NTS may have also been involved in trafficking the Oswalds around inside of the Soviet Union when they were there. And we're going to take a look at a very important methodological aspect of the Kennedy assassination, namely the work of elements associated with the WACCFL in attempting to paint the assassination of President Kennedy as a Soviet assassination conspiracy. Specifically, we're going to take a look at attempts to portray Lee Harvey Oswald as a Soviet agent, because many of the members of the Warren Commission who helped to cover up Kennedy's assassination were doing so because they felt that if the American public came to perceive that a communist or a Marxist sympathizer had assassinated President Kennedy, that might result in a Third World War. We will also be touching on an essay that appeared in a recent issue of Tikkun magazine, that's spelled T-I-K-K-U-N, in which Professor Peter Dale Scott describes how the Soviet assassin disinformation necessitated in the minds of some members of the Warren Commission and associated elements a cover-up of the assassination of John Kennedy. We will also be taking a look at a section of the book Blowback by Christopher Simpson, and we're going to take a look at how some of these elements, namely the NTS, the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, and many of the Gehlen Third Reich émigrés, came to be incorporated into the U.S. national security establishment, and how, as a result of their participation in the U.S. intelligence community, they were projected into the American political milieu, and it was just such a projection which enabled these very same elements to participate in the assassination of John Kennedy, a very direct interference, obviously, in American political life. We are going to take a look at how the methodology which ultimately came to fruition in the Reagan-Bush years and was concluded in August of 1991 represents a continuation of Third Reich espionage and political and psychological warfare techniques which were pursued by the U.S. national security establishment, and specifically as a result of the participation of the Galen Organization and related elements in the U.S. intelligence system. We're going to take a look at the politics of rollback or liberation, how they began with the Third Reich, were continued by the Galen element, and ultimately came to fruition during the August 1991 coup, in which the methodology of the NTS, the Solidarists, one Third Reich White Russian intelligence group, and the operational goals of the ABN, another Soviet emigre group which worked with the Third Reich and later the U.S. intelligence system, they came to fruition in August of 1991. We're going to take a look, too, by way of conclusion, at two interesting bits of information. One, an article from the Los Angeles Times from yesterday, that being July 31st of 1992, for the benefit of those who eventually hear the program on tape. And we're also going to take a look at a section of another essay from the current issue of Covert Action Information Bulletin, this by way of looking at how the political forces that we will be examining in Radio Free America 37 not only were instrumental in the defeat of one of Nazi Germany's major opponents during World War II, namely the Soviet Union, which no longer exists, but this will begin to point ahead to the further development of this archive show, in which we will examine how these same elements operating in this same way brought the United States to its knees economically as well, thereby, at least from an economic standpoint, defeating the Third Reich's other major military opponent, namely the red, white, and blue, the U.S. of A., which we are all living in today, because our economy is a basket case, not to the extent that the Soviet economy was, but the full-court press strategy outlined by Sean Gervasi in Covert Action Information Bulletin's issues number 35 and 39, which I accessed in Radio Free America number 36, the destabilization of the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. That very same strategy not only bankrupted the Soviet Union, it has bankrupted the United States, and it has left Germany to develop the economic resources of the former Soviet Union in Eastern Europe. As the Prussian military theoretician von Clausewitz said, war is the continuation of politics by other means. We can also turn that around. Politics is the continuation of war by other means, and we're going to be taking a look at how that continuation of war by other means, first of all, was instrumental in the assassination of President Kennedy, and how it resulted in the breakup and defeat of the Soviet Union, and how it has resulted in the economic humbling of the United States. Once again, that's what we have on tap for this evening. Hold on to your hats, get your tape recorders ready, because in addition to last week's broadcast and a portion of a number of broadcasts to come, we're going to begin taking a look at Radio Free America number 37, how the United States lost the Second World War, and this is in no way a figurative representation. I will be in future broadcasts outlining and delineating how the historical forces that came together in 11/22/63 developed, and we will begin taking a look at how the Galen Organization, one of the most important and least understood political entities in history and military entities, literally became a Trojan horse. It literally was a Third Reich entity that we took in the mistaken belief that this represented an offering from the gods. Well, it was not an offering from the gods. There's the old expression, killing two birds with one stone. Well, the Galen Organization, as we shall see, a Trojan horse, killed one bird, i.e. the American eagle, and one bear, the Soviet bear, to the detriment of the citizens of both countries and to the benefit of the citizens and political forces and economic forces in Germany. That's what we have on tap for this evening. Hold on to your hats. After a musical break, we will be back with Radio Free America 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. We're now going to proceed with the main body of tonight's archive show. This program will be entitled, or is entitled, and it will include part of last week's program as well, How the United States Lost the Second World War. This will go into the archives as Radio Free America program number 37. We're going to begin by taking a look at an article that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle of yesterday. Actually, yesterday was August 1st, not July 31st. This particular article is by Michael Taylor of the San Francisco Chronicle staff. It is entitled, Lawyers Plan Mock Trial in JFK Death, subheaded, Part of Bar Association Convention in San Francisco, and it reads in part as follows. Some of America's sharpest lawyers and judges will take a new look at the murder of President Kennedy in a high-tech, high-profile mock trial in San Francisco of alleged assassin Lee Harvey Oswald, replete with premises of new evidence in what one lawyer called, quote, the most investigated crime in the history of the world, unquote. Well, it is not the most investigated crime, at least not by the legal authorities. We'll see what happens in this mock trial. Skipping down in the article. The showcase of the trial will be the introduction of cutting-edge technical evidence developed by Failure Analysis Associates, a Menlo Park firm that investigates and analyzes disasters such as plane crashes or the collapse of offshore oil rigs. For example, engineer Jeff Lotz, L-O-T-Z, who will help the prosecution try to prove that Oswald was the lone assassin, said new enhanced inspection of the assassination movie taken by dressmaker Abraham Zapruder shows that the right lapel on the jacket of then Texas Governor John Connally moved at the same time Kennedy was shot in the neck. Connally, sitting in front of Kennedy in the presidential limousine, was wounded in the attack. Lotz said this new information supports the hotly contested Warren Commission finding that one bullet, known by critics as the magic bullet, went through Kennedy and wounded Connally. Failure Analysis also fired a bullet through a skull filled with beef brain and covered with pig skin to analyze another point of argument raised by conspiracy theorists that the piece of film showing that Kennedy's head snapping backwards proves he was shot from the front. Oswald allegedly shooting from the Texas School Book Depository was behind Kennedy. Lotz said his investigation showed that when the skull was shot, quote, the motion of the head going back and to the left was consistent with a shot from behind, unquote, because the bullet created a shock wave in the brain that caused an explosion of the brains coming out of Kennedy's skull on the right. This made the head go back and to the left, Lotz said. As anyone who has heard me discuss the assassination of President Kennedy knows, the single most important thing about examining this particular historical event is to understand the historical forces at work. I do not think there's a great deal of value at this stage of the game in running around the grassy knoll and counting bullets and cartridge cases. However, I do think it's important for the uninitiated, particularly young people, to be aware of just how ludicrous the Warren Commission's thesis was. The Warren Commission thesis is not only wrong, but the evidence or the allegations by engineer Lotz notwithstanding, it is physically impossible in all of its major respects. The Warren Commission could not admit that more than 3 shots were fired in the 6 seconds that Lee Harvey Oswald had to shoot. One shot exploded Kennedy's head. One shot missed the motorcade completely and wounded a bystander named James Tague. On the ricochet, that left 1 bullet and 1 bullet only to account for all 7 non-fatal wounds in Lee Harvey Oswald and Governor Connally. In addition to the fact that that bullet would have had to have made several sharp turns in mid-air without being acted upon by an external force in direct contravention of the law of inertia, the fact of the matter is that the bullet residua taken from those 7 non-fatal wounds allegedly made by the same bullet exceeds the amount of material missing from that bullet. There's a basic principle of mathematics. The whole is equal to the sum of its parts. The sum of the parts cannot be greater than the whole. Therefore, the entire Warren Commission thesis is down the drain. End of story. The entire thesis is completely ridiculous. The rifle allegedly used by Oswald has never been linked with Lee Harvey Oswald in any hard sense, and in fact, the testimony of Marina Oswald was manipulated by some of the same Galen elements we'll be looking at this evening in order to help frame her husband. Beyond that, the rifle was sighted in for a left-handed shooter. The scope was sighted for a left-handed shooter. Oswald, who was a lousy marksman to begin with, was right-handed. He wouldn't have been able to hit the motorcade at all. We can go on from there. But the Warren Commission thesis is absolutely ridiculous, and Engineer Lott here can present all of this supposed evidence, such as Connally's lapel moved. Well, his wrist didn't move at the time, and it was supposedly being shattered by a bullet. This is the ultimate example of someone jumping on a dime or dancing on a dime. And I think the alleged evidence that will be presented by Failure Analysis Associates and Jeff Lotz, all of that plus $1 will get you a one-way ride on the average municipal transit system. We will be looking at some of the physical evidence this evening. The entire Warren Commission hypothesis is ridiculous on its surface, so do not pay a whole lot of attention to this particular mock trial if, in fact, as I suspect, the verdict will be that Lee Harvey Oswald was guilty, the lone nut assassin, and I wouldn't pay a whole lot of attention to Engineer Lots and Failure Analysis Associates. I think what we can expect from this is lots of failure and damned little analysis under the circumstances. We're going to begin this evening by reviewing some of the information that we looked at last week in the first part of what will be included in the archives as Radio Free America program number 37. Now, I began by examining an article that was authored by Anthony L. Kimmery, last name Kimery, in the current issue of Covert Action Information Bulletin number 41. This article is entitled George Bush and the CIA in the Company of Friends, and Covert Action Information Bulletin issue number 41 is the summer 1992 issue. For those of you who would like to subscribe to Covert Action, and it is the best periodical available on the subject of the U.S. intelligence apparatus, Covert Action Information Bulletin is at 1500 Massachusetts Avenue, Northwest, number 732. That is in Washington, D.C., 20005. Again, Covert Action Information Bulletin, 1500 Massachusetts Avenue, Northwest, number 732, Washington, D.C., 20005. And I would strongly recommend that you not only pick up number 41, but subscribe to the publication. It's a quarterly, and you will save money by subscribing rather than picking it up at the newsstand. Now, in this particular article, Anthony L. Kimmery cites compelling circumstantial evidence, though not absolutely conclusive, that in fact George Bush, who supposedly first joined the CIA when then President Gerald Ford, a key Warren Commission member, appointed him as Director of Central Intelligence in 1976. In fact, there is, as Kimmery presents, substantive evidence that George Bush was operating for the CIA probably from the days of his graduation from Yale. What we looked at in that particular article reviewing the Ivy League and Yale University in particular was a hotbed for CIA recruiting in the immediate post-World War II years, and a fellow named Alan Skip Waltz was in all probability the individual who recruited George Bush into the CIA. George Bush's father, Prescott Bush Sr., a Yale graduate, was not only a member of the transatlantic financial and industrial axis that we looked at in the archive shows, in an addendum to the archive. Well, actually, we looked at in the archive shows and also added an addendum some months back. The Uncle Sam and the Swastika broadcast deals with the active cooperation between U.S. industrialists and financiers and those of the fascist powers of Europe, including the Third Reich. Prescott Bush Sr. was part of that transatlantic financial and industrial axis, and I use the term axis literally here. In addition to being a patron of Yale, he also was a very close friend of William Casey, an OSS veteran. The OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, was America's World War II intelligence service, a precursor of the CIA, and William Casey became the director of Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign when George Bush was vice presidential candidate, and there are indications that both Bush and Casey may have been involved in the October surprise. By the way, I would recommend the book The Old Boys by Burton Hirsch. Casey, of course, became director of the CIA under Ronald Reagan and was deeply involved in, among other things, the Iran-Contra scandal until his untimely demise in 1987. He had a fit, or he collapsed and in convulsions just before he was going to testify before Congress. Next, Anthony Kimmery goes on to set forth circumstantial evidence that, in fact, George Bush's work on behalf of the petroleum industry also involved his work on behalf of the CIA. One of the people who was instrumental in introducing George Bush to a company called IDESCO, a subsidiary of a petroleum firm, a petroleum engineering firm called Dresser Industries, DRESSER, that individual was Henry Neil Mallon. Mallon, in addition to being, like George Bush, a member of the elite Skull and Bones Society from Yale University that itself is deeply involved with the CIA, or has been over the years, Henry Neil Mallon was a close personal friend of Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was a key OSS operative during the Second World War. William Casey, by the way, was in charge of secret intelligence for the OSS in Europe. Allen Dulles, of course, went on to become director of the CIA. Dulles himself, as we looked at in Uncle Sam and the Swastika, a key element of this transatlantic financial and industrial axis. Dulles was fired by President Kennedy and later served on the Warren Commission, allegedly investigating President Kennedy's death. One of the interesting pieces of information that is documented by Anthony L. Kimmery was that George Bush worked with George de Mohrenschildt. George de Mohrenschildt was a white Russian, a director of Nobel Oil, and an individual who had spied on behalf of Nazi Germany during the Second World War. De Mohrenschildt had worked closely for a period of time with Baron Constantin Maydell, last name Maydell. Maydell had been in charge of all Abwehr activities in North America for a period of time during the Second World War. The Abwehr was German military intelligence. Many of the members of the Abwehr II group, for a time headed up by Maydell, were recruited into the Reinhard Gehlen organization after World War II. And Kimmery maintains, and he makes a good case, though not an airtight one, that the relationship between George Bush and George de Mohrenschildt may very well have been that of agent and intelligence handler. Both men were in the petroleum industry, and both men, in all probability, were deeply involved, well, de Mohrenschildt certainly and Bush probably, involved in using their work on behalf of the petroleum industry for intelligence activities on behalf of the CIA. One of the points that Kimmery makes is one of the pieces of information he presents is testimony by unnamed former intelligence operatives that in fact George Bush had been deeply involved with the CIA, and specifically after Fidel Castro came to power in Cuba and nationalized the Cuban oil industry, George Bush and the CIA were very active to help destabilize Castro, to attempt to get their fingers or their hands back on that Cuban oil. It is a matter of public record, and we went into that last week, that George de Mohrenschildt was deeply involved in the Cuban oil exploration business. It was maintained by some of these unnamed former U.S. intelligence operatives that in fact George Bush's Zapata Oil Company was used as a front for some of the CIA's anti-Castro activities. And of course, as we have looked at in the Guns of November programs dealing with the assassination of Kennedy, the CIA's anti-Castro Cuban milieu was deeply involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. The assassination was not done by the CIA, but elements of the CIA and the FBI were involved, necessitating a cover-up by both institutions. After that, we took a look at how the Mexican oil industry was nationalized by Mexico, and they began turning to, among others, the Soviet Union for assistance in developing their oil resources. This was of even greater alarm to the CIA, and both George de Mohrenschildt and George Bush appear to have been deeply involved in CIA activities to keep the U.S. petroleum industry's fingers deeply into the Mexican oil development situation. We took note of also that George de Mohrenschildt was very active on behalf of a subsidiary of Brown and Root. That company was not only deeply involved with developing the political career of George Bush, but also the political careers of Richard Nixon and Lyndon Baines Johnson as well. Bush used Dresser Industries again as an apparent cover for his CIA activities, and Bush and his Zapata company got a handsome economic reward from the Mexican petroleum industry. We also took a look at a piece of information which is contained in a miscellaneous archive show called George Bush's Political Resume, namely that George Bush was apparently dispatched to gauge the reaction of the anti-Castro Cuban exile community in Miami to the assassination of President Kennedy. We are going to take a look later in the broadcast at how that particular community behaved. Following that, we took a look at the apparent long-term relationship between George Bush and Theodore Shackley, a key CIA operative. Bush was ambassador to China at the time that Theodore Shackley was in charge of the CIA's Far East Division. Then Bush became director of Central Intelligence and appointed Shackley associate deputy director of operations, one of the most important areas in the CIA. Then George Bush became vice president, was apparently involved in aspects of the Iran-Contra scandal, and Theodore Shackley, the supposed ex-CIA agent, in fact was operating as well in the Iran-Contra scandal. Following that, we took a look at Gerald Ford, again a key member of the Warren Commission. He appointed George Bush Director of Central Intelligence, and in that capacity, George Bush was instrumental in frustrating congressional probes of possible CIA connections to Oswald and Jack Ruby. I would also note, too, that there are numerous other ways, and numerous other areas in which George Bush crops up in connection with the investigation of Kennedy's assassination. For one thing, it was George Bush who alerted the FBI to a young Republican from Houston who Bush felt may have been involved in the assassination. In my opinion, this was probably an attempt by Bush to lead the investigation astray. Certainly, it would have been necessary for a Kennedy assassination insider, and Bush was certainly involved with elements and with the milieu that was involved with the Kennedy assassination, even if he himself was not. It would have been essential to have an insider as director of CIA while Congress was probing CIA connections, possible CIA connections to Oswald and Ruby, as well as when the House Select Committee on Assassinations was formed in 1976. I would also note that George Bush, a director of Zapata Oil, was the person who owned the building in which Jack Ruby's Carousel Club was housed. And we also took a look at connections between George Bush and Dusty Miller, a key Teamster operative, a member of the Teamsters Union, who also was in contact with Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby phoned Dusty Miller shortly before the assassination of John Kennedy. After that, we took a look at a section from the aforementioned manuscript by Dr. Peter Dale Scott, namely Government Documents and the JFK Assassination. We took a look, both in that document and from the book High Treason, to which we will be returning this evening, at the involvement, or the almost certain involvement, of George de Mohrenschildt with the Third Reich's intelligence activities. We also took a look at something that we will be taking a look at much greater length this evening, namely the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald, who had supposedly defected to the Soviet Union and betrayed to the Soviet Union top-secret information, not only about the United States North American radar defense nets, but about the U-2 project, how when he returned to the United States, he not only wasn't arrested for treason, but he was met upon his return not by the FBI or CIA, but by a fellow named Spaz T. Raikin, R-A-I-K-I-N, and Raikin was the Secretary General of the American Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, the latter, the ABN, an organization put together by Adolf Hitler in 1943, and we will be talking about that at great length this evening. We then took a look at the intelligence community, CIA, and petroleum industry milieu, of which both George Bush and George de Mohrenschildt were part, and we took a look at their profound role, their pivotal role in handling the Oswalds in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. We will be returning to that at considerable length this evening. Following that, we took a look at George de Mohrenschildt's role in attempting to develop the Cuban oil industry. Obviously, when Fidel Castro nationalized the Cuban petroleum industry, that brought that to a head. So what we're looking at, what we began looking at last week, and what we're going to be looking at length and in detail this evening, is a milieu involving the petroleum industry, the intelligence community, the Galen organization, or elements involved with and closely connected to it. We're going to be taking a look at the assassination of President Kennedy, and we will be looking at this evening the forces, the political forces which had formed and which were instrumental in killing President Kennedy, how they performed in connection with the Kennedy assassination, and also how they have affected the world that has come out of that tragic event. We're going to begin, first of all, by taking a look at some sections, reviewing in detail some sections from a long section of the Dallas Conspiracy that I read last week. We were limited for time, but I'm going to review some of those. Once again, the Dallas Conspiracy, also authored by Peter Dale Scott of the University of California at Berkeley. For my money, one of the preeminent political intellects in the world today, a truly brilliant individual. In the beginning of Chapter 3 of the Dallas Conspiracy, now bear in mind again, we're going to be taking a look at the petroleum industry, the intelligence community, the considerable degree of overlap and cooperation between them, and in turn the involvement of many of these Soviet émigrés who worked for the Galen organization. We'll be taking a look at their involvement with this milieu, and we will be taking a look at the pivotal role that they played in handling the Oswalds. Now, again, bear in mind that Lee Harvey Oswald was demonstrably innocent. The importance of examining this particular milieu is to understand the nature of the forces that were at work to overthrow the government of the United States. The assassination of President Kennedy was very important in a number of different respects. It represented, as we looked at in our Aryan Nation series, the culmination of a decades-long constitutional struggle between the military, who've never liked the idea of having a civilian commander-in-chief, and the executive branch. That was resolved on 11/22/63 in favor of the military. It also represented, as we will see, the triumph of the rollback or liberation theory of fighting the Cold War over the containment theory of, once again, fighting the Cold War. But beyond that, and even more importantly, it represented the coming of fascism to America, or the triumph of fascism to America. It also represented, in a very real sense, as we will be examining during the course of the archive show this evening, the end of the Second World War, and the Axis won, and the Allies, including the red, white, and blue, the U.S. of A., lost. And if that seems like a preposterous claim, just stick around and examine what we're going to be going through this evening. The first section of the Dallas Conspiracy that I'm going to review this evening begins: the case that Oswald was an agent is strengthened by the paradoxical condition of poverty and privilege in which the Oswalds lived after their arrival in Texas. Though he severed all contact with his family after Thanksgiving 1962, and though he seems to have made not one single friend otherwise, Oswald and his wife Marina were now favored with the attentions of a small circle of wealthy Russians and their friends, connected almost exclusively with the politically influential petroleum engineering industry. This next couple of sentences indicates, actually, the next two sentences indicate just how central this petroleum engineering industry milieu, these white Russians, were in handling the Oswalds. Bear in mind that Lee Harvey Oswald was supposedly a welder, a handyman, a warehouse worker. Let's see just how instrumental these people were in handling the Oswalds. The Warren Commission's list of 34 persons, quote, with whom Lee Harvey Oswald may have had contact, unquote, many of whom met Oswald for only a single evening, is striking testimony that Oswald's social life was entirely governed by his Russian patrons. Every single person on this list, as well as some others whom the Commission did not include, had been met by the Oswalds through these patrons. This includes the alleged liberal Ruth Paine of the ACLU, who assumed the same babysitting role between mid-April of 1963, the time of the Walker incident, and November 22, 1963, when relations between the Oswald family and the Russian community were temporarily suspended. This Russian community, by no accident, had links with wealth, petroleum, the political machines of both parties, government, and above all, intelligence activities. Take, for example, the first two people whom Oswald contacted allegedly in his search for someone in Fort Worth who spoke Russian. Of the two, the Russian-born Peter Gregory, Gregory, a petroleum engineer, was a personal friend of Mike Howard, one of the two Secret Service agents who isolated Marina Oswald in the days after the assassination. We shall see that Howard used Gregory in his interrogation of Marina, and that Gregory abused this responsibility by significantly distorting what Marina said. Well, again, note who it was that this supposed traitor to the United States, an avowed Marxist, was hanging out with. He was hanging out with about as diehard an anti-communist group of people as possible. They were all very, very wealthy, very socially prominent, and here was a supposed welder, greaser, and warehouse worker being trafficked around by these people. Also note, and we're going to come back to this because the Walker shooting is going to be one of the major elements in our analysis this evening, Take note that from mid-April of 1963 until November 22, 1963, this Russian community in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, again deeply involved with the intelligence community, severed all contact with the Oswalds, which is incriminating in and of itself. It indicates a conspiracy because the information that Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly shot at Edwin Walker supposedly did not surface until December 3rd, 1963. So this sudden severing of contact between this very influential petroleum and intelligence and Galen-linked milieu is a very, very interesting phenomenon under the circumstances. Also take note that these same White Russians, these same Galen-linked elements, were instrumental in extracting false testimony from Marina Oswald. We're going to come back to that later. And bear in mind, too, above all else, that George Bush, currently President of the United States, former director of the CIA, was not only an associate of George de Mohrenschildt, but was obviously deeply involved with this same petroleum and intelligence milieu, if not in fact, and he may have been involved in the assassination of John Kennedy itself. The next section of the Dallas conspiracy that we're going to review this evening begins. One of the chief Russian guardians, George Bouet, B-O-U-H-E, was a 60-year-old personal accountant for Louis MacNaughton, capital M-A-C, capital N-A-U-G-H-T-O-N, of the famous oil exploration consulting service de Gaulier and MacNaughton, a man with numerous CIA contacts. De Gaulier is spelled capital D-E, capital G-O-L-Y-E-R. Continuing. Bouet was said actually to have been, quote, rather mad at Marina for taking an apartment at Oak Cliff because it was rather too far for him to drive and help her when she needed help with the baby, unquote. Lee Oswald, who worked in this period as a welder, greaser, or handyman, was also driven to parties and otherwise cared for by a member of the Dallas Petroleum Club and World Affairs Council, Count Sergei de Mohrenschildt, who knew Jackie's family and who admitted working with French intelligence during World War II. Recall, as we saw last week, that was actually German intelligence unless he was working with the fascist Vichy French intelligence service. Continuing. De Mohrenschildt, a key witness in corroborating Marina's story that Oswald shot at Walker, and bear in mind here again, interrupting, that de Mohrenschildt was instrumental in corroborating Marina's story. Beginning again, de Mohrenschildt, a key witness in corroborating Marina's story that Oswald shot at Walker, also had numerous political and CIA contacts. He was accustomed to do business on a personal basis with such prominent backers of Lyndon Johnson as George Brown of Brown and Root, R-O-O-T, the firm whose lawyer, Charles Francis, helped save Johnson's Senate election in 1948, and John Mecom, M-E-C-O-M. And in a footnote to the passage about Louis MacNaughton, and bear in mind the de Gaulier and MacNaughton Corporation, because that's front and center here, a petroleum consulting service, an oil exploration consulting service of the CIA contacts of Louis MacNaughton and the milieu he was involved with. Professor Scott adds in a footnote, for example, MacNaughton was a director of Republic National Gas and the Republic National Bank in Dallas with Carl Hoblitzelle, H-O-B-L-I-T-Z-E-L-L-E, who set up the CIA conduit Hoblitzelle Foundation. Skipping down, one trustee of the foundation was Sarah T. Hughes, H-U-G-H-E-S, the judge who, on November 22, 1963, administered the controversial oath of office to her friend and patron, Lyndon Johnson. Now note that both MacNaughton and Hoblitzelle were directors of, among other things, the Republic National Bank. That bank was owned by Texas oil billionaire H.L. Hunt, one of the prime movers in the John Birch Society and the American far right. We will be taking a look at the Hunt establishment, both H.L. and his sons, later on in the broadcast. And in another footnote to the passage about George de Mohrenschildt working with, among others, Brown of Brown and Root, we already touched on that in the Kimmery article. Professor Scott adds, George Brown was president of the Brown Foundation, a CIA conduit. A director of Brown's firm, Texas Eastern Transmission, was a trustee of the CIA conduit San Jacinto Fund, whose founder was John Mecom, again M-E-C-O-M. A third director of Texas Eastern, George A. Butler, B-U-T-L-E-R, was trustee of the CIA conduit Hobby Foundation with Mrs. Ovita Culp Hobby, H-O-B-B-Y, who sat on the CIA's Cuban Freedom Committee with the aforementioned Peter O'Donnell, Jr. According to Evans and Novak, the Brown brothers, quote, became Lyndon Johnson's personal vehicle for a lateral movement into the center of the new oil power, unquote. And of Peter O'Donnell in the previous footnote, Professor Scott says, the president of the Hublet-Sella Foundation was Peter O'Donnell, Jr., a Goldwater Republican who sat on the National Advisory Council of the Young Americans for Freedom with Robert Morris. By the way, Robert Morris was a former key aide to Senator Joe McCarthy. He also was General Edwin Walker's attorney. By the way, take note of John Mecom here. Again, last name M-E-C-O-M. John Mecom is the former owner of the New Orleans Saints of the National Football League. Now, again, take note of the intersection here between the intelligence community, the petroleum exploration industry, the milieu that was behind the political fortunes of Lyndon Johnson, and take note, again, of the fact that George Bush was deeply involved with this particular milieu. Now, remember again, de Gaulle and McNaughton. Bear in mind that McNaughton, along with Carl Hublet-Sella, was the director of the Republic National Bank. That is H.L. Hunt's, that was an H.L. Hunt property. And bear in mind that Hublet-Sella set up a CIA domestic funding conduit, one of whose trustees was the judge who administered the oath of office to Lyndon Johnson on 11/22/63. She was a Johnson protege. Bear in mind, as I said, that George de Mohrenschildt helped to corroborate Marina's story that Oswald shot at Walker. We'll be taking a look at that later. And again, bear in mind de Mohrenschildt's operations on behalf of Brown and Root and Texas Eastern that we looked at in the Kimry article. And bear in mind that Brown and Root were deeply involved not only with the backing of Lyndon Johnson, but also Richard Nixon, whose probable participation in the assassination we looked at in the Guns of November Part 3 and an addendum that I did in late June. Bear in mind they were also deeply involved, that is to say Brown and Root, with the political fortunes of George Bush. And as we've seen, Brown and Root, too, inextricably linked with this petroleum and intelligence milieu that we're looking at this evening. The next section of the Dallas Conspiracy that we read last week and that I want to review this evening begins as follows. Before April, the avowed Marxist Oswald was cared for by the old guard Russians. These were mostly aristocratic and united in their nostalgia for the Ancien Regime in contrast to the more recent and plebeian post-war émigré. Differences between these two emigrations produced two separate Russian parishes in Dallas during the 1950s, each claiming to be more anti-communist than the other, but divided on the issue of what to do about the, quote, liberation, unquote, of Russia. Bear in mind liberation, because liberation or rollback theory is front and center in this program. Continuing. To judge from their testimony, the old guard, even if czarist in their nostalgia, echoed the policies of the American CIA establishment of which they were indeed part. The new arrivals included Ukrainians and other non-Russian Soviet minorities, and some of them, although less aristocratic, were ideologically more right-wing and revanchist. At least two of the new arrivals were far to the right of de Mohrenschildt, one of them described in one breath as a, quote, leftist and as, quote, an Eisenhower Republican, unquote. Unlike all the other Russians investigated by the Commission, these two men, Ilya Mamantov, M-A-M-A-N-T-O-V, and Igor Voshinin, V-O-S-H-I-N-I-N, are said to have made a point of never meeting the Oswalds before the assassination. Yet it was their circle, rather than the old guard, which adopted Marina thereafter. The two Russians who did not meet Oswald are even more interesting than the rest who did. Igor Voshinin was a member of a worldwide Russian organization called the NTS, in English usually called either the National Alliance of Solidarists or the National Toilers Alliance, a semi-covert organization working closely with revanchist elements in West Germany, with the Asian People's Anti-Communist League in Kuomintang in Taiwan, and, at one time, until the pro-Ukrainian ABN drove them out, with the Latin American CIADC and their proposed World Anti-Communist Conference for Freedom and Liberation. Continuing with Scott's essay, although there is little research on the NTS, they are known to have been founded in 1930 by a group of émigrés, nearly all engineers in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. Many of the Russians who came to Texas after World War II had lived in Serbia, including Voshinin himself, an engineer. During the war, many of the NTS collaborated with the Nazis, and particularly the Nazi Liebrand in Rosenberg's Ostministerium, who accepted the Solidarists because of, quote, their ideological proximity to fascism, unquote. As such, they ran a training camp for the Nazis at Wüstrow and later supplied the right wing of the Russian forces grouped briefly by Himmler under the turncoat Russian general Vlasov, V-L-A-S-S-O-V. By the way, Wüstrow is W-U-S-T-R-A-U, and Liebrand is L-E-I-B-R-A-N-D-T. Rosenberg is Alfred Rosenberg, a key Nazi Party official, deeply involved. He himself was a Baltic German, deeply involved with Third Reich policy towards the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Now, in this particular passage that I just reviewed, there are several important things to take note of. First of all, remember the organization NTS. That is an organization, again, of anti-Bolshevik Russians. It worked deeply with the Third Reich. It also then worked with the U.S. intelligence apparatus, the CIA in particular. It became a key component of the Gehlen organization, and bear in mind that Igor Vushinin was a member of this particular organization. He, along with Mamontov, was one of the white Russians, or white Soviets, I should say. They were not all white, not all Russian, who were involved in handling Marina Oswald after the assassination. That handling of Marina Oswald was front and center to being able to fabricate her husband's alleged guilt. I would also note, too, that the NTS is one of the two major Third Reich Soviet emigre organizations that worked with the Gehlen organization and with our own intelligence system, and we're going to be taking a look at the operational methodology of the NTS and the operational goals of the ABN, which conflicted with it, although it worked with the NTS in the Third Reich, and also when the Gehlen group jumped to the CIA. We will see that there is a fundamental difference in their orientation towards how to handle the defeating of communism. The NTS basically sought to preserve the territorial integrity of the old Russian Empire, simply driving out the communists, whereas the ABN sought to break up the Soviet Union, or the former Russian Empire, into its constituent ethnic republics. As we will be seeing, what we saw in the abortive August coup of 1991, in which the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union collapsed, was a fulfillment, in all probability, of the methodology of the NTS, the tactical operations favored by the NTS, and the goals of the ABN. As we shall see, one of the major things that the NTS advocated was appealing to the elite cadre of the Soviet Union, in particular the military, and the NTS was apparently deeply involved with a successful infiltration of the GRU, Soviet military intelligence, and they advocated as a means of overthrowing communism, stimulating a revolt in the Red Army. Also note, too, that Vushinin and Mamontov had made a point of never meeting the Oswalds until after the assassination, when they met Marina. And note, as I cited earlier, that between mid-April of 1963 and 11/22/63, this Russian Gehlen CIA community in the Dallas-Fort Worth area severed all contact with the Oswalds. And again, it was on April 10th of 1963 that Lee Harvey Oswald supposedly shot at Major General Edwin Walker. The next section of the Dallas conspiracy that I'm going to review, and again, we read this last week. Once again, turning to the NTS, of particular interest in the story of Marina Oswald are the repeated stories that the NTS had succeeded in planting agents inside the Soviet Union, particularly in the Army, a fact which may or may not have something to do with the known penetration of Soviet Army intelligence, the GRU, by the CIA. The NTS, along with its Ukrainian enemies in the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, also collaborated closely with the efforts of the APACL in Taipei, where the NTS maintains permanent representation, to establish the proposed World Anti-Communist Conference for Freedom and Liberation, until the NTS was excluded by a coalition between Catholic Ukrainians and anti-communists from Latin America. During the Hungarian uprising of 1956, for example, the Asian People Anti-Communist League's message of support was transmitted to Hungary via the services of the NTS Radio Free Russia. This makes it likely that the NTS was also in contact in Texas with the allies of the APACL and through them with the John Birch Society and the supporters of General Walker. Neither Bushinin nor his friend Ilya Mamontov was asked whether he belonged to the NTS. Mamontov spontaneously denied being a member of the John Birch Society, even before de Mohrenschildt had suggested that he was, while singling out him rather than Bushinin as the one excessive rightist of the Russian community. He was, however, a geologist, that is to say, Mamontov. He was, however, a geologist with the Sun Oil Company, whose owners, the Pugh family, have in the last few years given well over $1 million to right-wing organizations such as the Christian Freedom Foundation. The excessive rightist Mamontov, who never met Oswald, was, however, the one Russian who personally knew the alleged liberal Ruth Paine, apart from his mother-in-law, who was her tutor. And it was Mamontov who was the first Russian to renew the community's contact with Marina some 5 hours after the assassination. He had been called by telephone to serve as interpreter at the first questioning of Marina in the presence of their mutual friend, Ruth Paine. It was not, however, Ruth Paine who had first contacted him to interpret, but, quote, Mr. Jack Crichton, C-H-R-I-C-H-T-O-N, and misspelling, by the way, a petroleum operator, quote, connected with the Army Reserve Intelligence Service, unquote. The Commission did not pursue the question of why Mr. Crichton or Army intelligence should have been involved in the Oswald affair. If they had, they would have learned that until 1962, Mr. Crichton was also a vice president of the Empire Trust Company, a firm whose leading shareholders, the interrelated families of Loeb, L-O-E-B, Lehman, L-E-H-M-A-N, and Bronfman, B-R-O-N-F-M-A-N, are said by Stephen Birmingham to have maintained, quote, something very like a private CIA around the world, unquote, to protect their other investments such as in Cuba, in Guatemala, and in General Dynamics. We shall soon see that Birmingham's allusion to the Loeb, Lehman, Bronfman, quote, private CIA, unquote, is corroborated by the mysterious intervention of Jack Crichton in the Oswald case, and that the proper choice of Marina's interpreter was crucial to the development of the case against her husband. Mr. Crichton's example also shows that such a private CIA, of which there are many in the world of high finance, does not compete against existing intelligence and law enforcement agencies, but infiltrates and works within them. Thus, Crichton was simultaneously an Army Reserve intelligence officer and an employee of Empire Trust, one of whose directors was Bowie's and Ford's employer, Lewis MacNaughton. Crichton himself had been a vice president of DeGolyer and MacNaughton from 1946 to 1950. Crichton, moreover, had not only intelligence but political connections. In 1964, still an Army Reserve intelligence officer, he ran unsuccessfully against John Connally as Republican candidate for governor of Texas. By the way, the Ford here is not Gerald Ford, but a fellow named Declan Ford, another member of the white Russian community in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Galen-related element that was instrumental in handling the Oswalds, also connected with DeGolyer and MacNaughton. Now, in this particular section, again, note the NTS, one of the two major Galen elements that we're going to be looking at, or we are looking at this evening, and note significant indications that it had been instrumental in penetrating the GRU, Soviet military and intelligence. Bear in mind, too, by the way, I should have mentioned it at the top of the broadcast, that these two monographs, both the Dallas Conspiracy and Government Documents in the JFK Assassination, were authored in 1971 and 1972, respectively. There is a lot more information on the NTS now, so we will be turning to that later. There is also a very significant question about the possible, and I say possible, handling of the Oswalds inside of the Soviet Union. This is, as I like to say, food for thought and grounds for further research. But in addition to their obvious handling of the Oswalds in the United States, the Galen-related elements and the NTS in particular, which apparently was involved in a successful penetration of the GRU, they may have been involved in handling the Oswalds inside of the former Soviet Union. Now, note again that the NTS was part of the World Anti-Communist Conference for Freedom and Liberation. It worked for a time with the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, about which we shall have more to say later. And note again that, as we shall return to later, the NTS, as well as the ABN, was apparently in touch with the John Birch Society and General Walker. Now, note again that the NTS was part of the World Anti-Communist Conference for Freedom and Liberation. It worked for a time with the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, about which we shall have more to say later. And note again that, as we shall return to later, the NTS, as well as the ABN, was apparently in touch with the John Birch Society and General Walker. Note also that Ilya Mamontov was an engineer with the Sun Oil Company, owned by the Pew family. They were major funders of the far right, and one of their top political advisors, not mentioned in this particular section of the Dallas conspiracy, but one of their major political operatives was a fellow named Hans Sennholz, S-E-N-N-H-O-L-T-Z. Sennholz had been a Luftwaffe interrogator during the Second World War. Interrogator or interrogator is usually a euphemism in the intelligence community for torturer. By the way, later, Sennholz went to work for Western Goals. Note also that Jack Crichton, who contacted Mamontov to act as Marina's interpreter along with Peter Gregory, was, again, a petroleum engineer and had worked for de Gaulier and McNaughton. He also was in the Army Reserve Intelligence Service. And note also that he was a trustee of Empire Trust with the aforementioned Louis McNaughton, and Louis McNaughton of de Gaulier and McNaughton, again the employer of George Bouet and Declan Ford, two of the other white Russian Galen-related people who were instrumental in trafficking the Oswalds around in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and thereby played an important role in helping to frame Lee Harvey Oswald for the assassination. And again, bear in mind that George de Mohrenschildt, who was also close, by the way, to the family of Jackie Kennedy, the Bouviers. In fact, when he was testifying for the Warren Commission, after he finished, he would go and have dinner with Jackie's mother. Bear in mind that de Mohrenschildt was also deeply involved, and de Mohrenschildt, an associate of George Bush, deeply involved with corroborating Marina's bogus story that Lee Harvey Oswald had fired at General Edwin Walker. Next, we're going to turn to a very, very important connection, and this concerns the operational and ideological fusing of these Galen-related elements that I have been speaking about with, and bear in mind that this intelligence petroleum Galen milieu involved George de Mohrenschildt, or George Bush, I should say. Bush may or may not have been involved in the actual assassination of John Kennedy, certainly deeply involved in the milieu, and quite obviously involved as Director of Central Intelligence with frustrating investigations into the Kennedy assassination. But what we're going to be looking at now is one of the most important things to understand about the assassination of John Kennedy. It is important to study this particular event in order to understand the nature of the forces which performed this event, which killed Kennedy, literally staged a successful coup in the United States, so that we can understand the political nature of the forces which are ranged against us today and which have dominated the world in the years since 11/22/63. What we're going to be looking at now is how this petroleum intelligence national security milieu, which obviously involved some of the Galen-related elements discussed already, how this hooked up with elements of the American far right, specifically John Birch Society-related elements and the very influential Hunt family of Texas. H.L. Hunt was the scion of that particular family. His sons, in particular Nelson Bunker Hunt and Lamar Hunt, are very much on the scene today. Nelson Bunker Hunt we're going to talk about at considerable length this evening. It should be underscored here that there has never been any hard information linking the Hunt family with the assassination itself, but their names certainly crop up in numerous places during the course of the investigation into the assassination. It would not surprise me, and indeed it is suspected by many, that they were involved with the assassination itself, although as I want to underscore, there has never been any proof of that. Turning once again to government documents and the JFK assassination by Peter Dale Scott, we find, from their public stance and behavior, one would hardly expect H.L. Hunt or his sons Nelson and Lamar to be allied with any official CIA operation. For years, they have typified the kind of Texas independent oil operators who have complained about the policies of Washington, the major oil companies, and the CIA. More specifically, Nelson Bunker Hunt was one of the John Birch Society sponsors of the black-bordered, anti-Kennedy ad in the Dallas Morning News on November 22nd, an ad which, at a sponsor's insistence, attacked the CIA in an obvious reference to the coup against No Dinh Diem for, quote, arranging coups and having staunch anti-communist allies of the U.S. bloodily exterminated, unquote. No Dinh Diem was the former president of the former South Vietnam. He was assassinated on November 2nd, 1963. His name is spelled capital N-G-O, small D-I-N-H, capital D-I-E-M. Continuing. In this respect, it may be relevant that Madame New, NHU, had traveled to the United States with the nephew of a right-wing Texas oil man, Dudley Dougherty, D-O-U-G-H-E-R-T-Y, and that on coming to Dallas, she appeared at the October 23rd U.S. Day rally attended by Oswald and addressed by H.L. Hunt's protege, General Walker. But just as the CIA itself was bitterly divided over the question of Diem and Vietnam, so some CIA veterans and other elements within the U.S. intelligence community had close links to the Hunt, Walker, Minuteman coterie described by Treasury Agent Ellsworth, E-L-L-S-W-O-R-T-H. One of these persons was Mamontov's friend, Jack Alston Crichton of Army Intelligence Reserve, who served as a trustee of the H.L. Hunt Foundation. Crichton was also a member of the American Friends of the Katanga Freedom Fighters, a group organized by China lobbyist Marvin Liebman, L-I-E-B-M-A-N, to oppose U.S. CIA policies in the Congo. Now, by the way, that was because they felt they were too lenient. So note again, Jack Alston Crichton, that intersects with the same petroleum intelligence Galen milieu. He is a trustee of the H.L. Hunt Foundation. We're now going to take a look at, before I continue with this particular section of government documents in the JFK assassination, we're going to take a look now at the context in which the names of both H.L. Hunt and Lamar Hunt and Nelson Bunker Hunt crop up in connection with the investigation into the assassination of President Kennedy. We're going to read now from a book called The Assassination of JFK, By Coincidence or Conspiracy. It is produced by the Committee to Investigate Assassinations under the direction of Bernard Fensterwald, Jr. This was published in softcover by Zebra Books, copyrighted 1977. By the way, I would note that many people, including myself, suspect that Bernard Fensterwald himself was involved with the CIA. There are key omissions from this book. It's an excellent book and a necessary book, but there are key and seemingly inexplicable omissions. I would also note that Bernard Fensterwald became the attorney for Watergate burglar James McCord after his arrest. Generally, intelligence veterans use attorneys connected to the intelligence community when they are on trial. Of H.L. Hunt, Fensterwald and Company write as follows. The name of H.L. Hunt, the late Texas oil billionaire, has often been mentioned in regard to several areas of information surrounding the assassination. Hunt, who was perhaps the richest man in the United States, was a key financier and sponsor of various right-wing political activities during the early 1960s, and was the head of a business empire noted for both its toughness and important political connections. Hunt was also a bitter critic of President Kennedy and his brother Robert. The Warren Commission noted that many rumors and allegations had arisen following the assassination concerning the possible involvement of H.L. Hunt and other Texas oil men, and that the name of H.L. Hunt's son, Lamar Hunt, had been found in a notebook belonging to Jack Ruby. The Commission also established that on the day before the assassination, Jack Ruby had, quote, visited with a young lady who was job hunting in Dallas, unquote, and had driven the woman around in her search for employment that day. The woman, Connie Trammell, T-R-A-M-M-E-L, had become friends with Ruby several weeks earlier. The Warren report didn't mention where Ruby drove Trammell on November 21st, 1963, But an FBI interview report did to the office of Lamar Hunt at the H.L. Hunt headquarters in Dallas. Ruby's visit to the H.L. Hunt offices on the afternoon before the assassination occurred at roughly the same time that Mafia figure Jim Braden, B-R-A-D-E-N, was visiting there. Strong possibilities exist of Braden connections to both Jack Ruby and David Ferry in the days and weeks immediately preceding the assassination. So again, note that obviously Jack Ruby had crossed paths with the Hunt family in Texas. And again, bear in mind that Nelson Bunker Hunt helped to finance the black-bordered ad that appeared in the Dallas Morning News on November 22, 1963, accusing President Kennedy of treason. More about the Hunt political empire and its connections, skipping down in Fensterwald's book. When the Drew Pearson diaries from 1949 to 1959 were published in 1974, by the way, Drew Pearson was an American political columnist. He was succeeded by Jack Anderson, his protege. Beginning again, when the Drew Pearson diaries from 1949 to 1959 were published in 1974, an allegation about H.L. Hunt's possible financing of an earlier vice presidential candidate also surfaced. According to the entry for October 29th, 1952, an associate of Pearson had telephoned me from Texas, telephoned me from Texas to tell me about a conspiracy which began about 2 years ago by H.L. Hunt, the big oil man, and a publicity firm called Watson Associates to put Nixon into the vice presidency. He claims an untold amount of oil money had been behind Nixon for some time, and that all this was put over on Eisenhower without his knowing it. Later, some calls to Texas indicated the story is probably true. In 1968, prior to Wallace's selection of General Curtis LeMay as his third-party running mate, H.L. Hunt had apparently lobbied on behalf of another vice presidential prospect for Nixon's Republican ticket. According to the Texas Observer of August 23, 1968, the oil billionaire had personally buttonholed various party officials at the Republican convention in Miami to recommend a favorite conservative congressman as Richard Nixon's running mate, Representative Gerald R. Ford. Now, of course, later Gerald Ford, a key Warren Commission member, succeeded Richard Nixon after Spiro Agnew was forced to resign as vice president during the Watergate scandal. We took a look at Nixon's probable involvement in the Kennedy assassination in the Guns of November Part 3, and a major addendum to that from June of 1992. So we note that H.L. Hunt, in addition to being quite possibly a driving force behind getting Richard Nixon to be Eisenhower's vice president, was also lobbying Nixon to have Gerald Ford as his vice president in 1968. Bear in mind, it was President Gerald Ford who appointed George Bush Director of Central Intelligence as congressional investigations into the Kennedy assassination were beginning. By the way, also take note of Jim Braden. Jim Braden, who also was in Dallas to visit with the Hunt family and who may very well have been connected with both Ruby and David Ferry. Jim Braden was arrested in Dallas, Texas, in the Dow Tex building across the street from the Texas School Book Depository on November 22nd, 1963. More about the Hunt family and the context in which their names crop up in connection with the investigation into the assassination, not necessarily the assassination itself, although I personally think they probably were involved. We're going to begin reading now from High Treason, subtitled The Assassination of President John F. Kennedy, What Really Happened, by Robert J. Groden, G-R-O-D-E-N, and Harrison Edward Livingston. This was published in softcover by the Conservatory Press of New York and Baltimore, Maryland, and it was copyrighted in paperback in 1989. And of the Hunt family and more of their connections, we read from this particular book, quote, Hunt is the big man in Texas, the giant, the richest and the stingiest, the most powerful and the most solitary of the oil men. The opinions and the aversions of obstinate old men often lead to excesses. Embittered Puritan potentates, frightened to see their lives drawing to an end, are in even greater danger. In the streets of Texas, knock out the Kennedy stickers were already appearing on bumpers and windshields, unquote. The book from which these quotes are taken, Farewell America, was supposedly written by a, quote, James Hepburn, unquote, or, quote, pseudonym actual author or authors unknown, unquote, published in Europe, and traced to the presidential palace and French intelligence by Bill Turner, Turner, a former FBI man who has worked hard in this investigation. In it, we find that, quote, at 12:23 on November 22nd, from his office on the 7th floor of the Mercantile Building, Haroldson Lafayette Hunt watched John Kennedy ride towards Dealey Plaza, where fate awaited him at 12:30. A few minutes later, escorted by 6 men in 2 cars, Hunt left the center of Dallas without even stopping by his house. At that very moment, General Walker was in a plane between New Orleans and Shreveport. He joined Mr. Hunt in one of his secret hideaways across the Mexican border. There they remained for a month, protected by personal guards under the impassive eyes of the FBI. It was not until Christmas that Hunt, Walker, and their party returned to Dallas, unquote. General Walker's aide, Robert Surrey, S-U-R-R-E-Y, told the Midlothian Mirror that he played bridge regularly with James Hosty, the FBI man who had been to see the Oswalds and who destroyed a note written to him by Oswald. At the same time, Oswald was seen attending meetings at which General Walker was present or spoke after he was alleged to have shot at Walker. One meeting was held to raise money for the DRE, a Cuban anti-Castro group. Walker's address and phone number were in Oswald's address book. Skipping down, there is extensive evidence that Jack Ruby was involved in supplying arms to the Cubans and also knew Walker. William McEwen Duff, M-C-E-W-A-N, D-U-F-F, who worked for Walker, says he saw Ruby go to Walker's house. By the way, one thing, I may be wrong, although certainly there are considerable degrees of intersection between the DeGolyer-McNaughton milieu that we looked at earlier and the Hunt. It may be the Mercantile National Bank that was the Hunt Bank, not the Republican National Bank, so there may be a slight amendment to that. I'm going to have to go double-check it. I think Republic National Bank was Hunt. That may be an incorrect fact. I may have a mnemonic error under the circumstances, but certainly there are considerable degrees of intersection between the Galen Intelligence Petroleum milieu and the Hunt operations, and bear in mind that former DeGolyer and McNaughton employee and an individual who, along with Lewis McNaughton, was a trustee of the Empire Trust Company, the Loeb, Lehman, Bronfman Company, which had its own private CIA, Jack Crichton, who selected Mamontoff and Peter Gregory as Marina's interpreters after the assassination, was director of the H.L. Hunt Foundation. But as we've seen, Ruby went to the Hunt offices to bring Connie Trammell to a job interview. Jim Braden was also in Dallas, allegedly to visit Lamar Hunt. We've seen that certainly, as we took a look at, Lee Harvey Oswald had attended a meeting that was being held by the U.S. Day rally that H.L. Hunt protege General Edwin Walker had held, and there are also indications, certainly Oswald had, and this is interesting too because this attending of the meeting was after Oswald had supposedly tried to kill Edwin Walker. Note also that, at least according to William McEwen Duff, who worked for General Edwin Walker, Jack Ruby also knew Edwin Walker. Now this is worth taking note of because supposedly these are all unconnected events and unconnected people. There are no hookups supposedly between Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald. As we looked at some weeks back, the telephone company had records of calls between Ruby and Oswald. Supposedly there are no connections between any of these people, but in fact, obviously, there were many, many connections between these people, thus indicating the milieu that was involved in killing President Kennedy. I would note, too, that H.L. Hunt in the early 1950s was a protege, or worked very closely with a fellow named Gerald L.K. Smith. Gerald L.K. Smith was a person we looked at considerable length in Radio Free America programs 10 through 13, particularly number 10. Gerald L.K. Smith was an American fascist. His Christian mobilizers and their publication, The Cross and the Flag, not only worked directly with Third Reich intelligence representatives in the United States, namely two people who operated out of the German embassy in Washington named von Geinath, G-E-I-N-A-T-H, and Hans Luther, L-U-T-H-E-R, but Gerald L.K. Smith was also financed by American industrialist Henry Ford, who also helped to finance Adolf Hitler and whose industrial empire, or the European branch of which, was deeply involved with helping to arm the Third Reich. After the war, Gerald L.K. Smith was instrumental in giving rise to the contemporary Aryan nations. His protege, Wesley Swift, founded the Christian Nationalist Party. Actually, I guess L.K. Smith founded the Christian Nationalist Party. He was succeeded in that regard by Wesley Swift, and two of Wesley Swift's associates, named William Potter Gale and Richard Gurnt Butler, became in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s key figures with the Aryan nations. Butler still is today. William Potter Gale has since passed away. But we're going to take a look now at how this Native American fascist milieu, this Hunt, Edwin Walker, and bear in mind that Edwin Walker was a protege of H.L. Hunt. We're going to take a look at this Hunt, Walker, John Birch Society milieu and how it hooks up with this petroleum intelligence Galen milieu that we've been looking at. And bear in mind that Jack Alston Crichton, also an Army Reserve intelligence officer, was a trustee of the H.L. Hunt Foundation. Returning again to government documents in the JFK assassination, Nelson Bunker Hunt, meanwhile, had become the Texas representative of a German-based intelligence network, the ICDCC, or International Committee for the Defense of Christian Culture, which paradoxically united many of the CIA's most prominent opponents within the United States, most notably China lobbyist General Charles Willoughby, W-I-L-L-O-U-G-H-B-Y, General MacArthur's former G2 in Japan and Korea, with representatives from CIA-sponsored organizations abroad, such as the Ukrainians cultivated by the Galen Organization. One chairman of the ICDCC, Hermann Punder, P-U-N-D-E-R with an umlaut over the U, was a former Abwehr agent and close ally of Galen's sponsors Konrad Adenauer and Hermann Abs of the Deutsche Bank, while the later chairman, Theodor Oberlander, was close to the right-wing German emigre group to whose newspaper General Walker spoke by long-distance telephone on November 22, 1963, transmitting the story, accepted by the Warren Report, that Oswald had shot at Walker in April of 1963. The ICDCC also appears to have been particularly concerned about the future of Vietnam. Thus, Oberlander represented the ICDCC at the 1966 conference of the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, a pro-Diem group, along with several of Diem's original backers in the United States, notably Father Raymond D. Yeager, J-E-E-G-H-E-R, of the Free Pacific Association, and such other luminaries as Tom Charles Houston, H-U-S-T-O-N, then the Secretary General of Marvin Liebman's World Youth Crusade for Freedom, and later, after a 2-year stint in Army intelligence, the author of the White House Houston Plan. The ICDCC and Willoughby's allied Foreign Intelligence Digest united many of the American opponents of Kennedy whose names we have encountered already. Among these were Walker's friend Billy James Hargis of the Christian Crusade, Diem's patron Father Raymond de Yeager, and Revelo Oliver's intelligence source Frank Capel. Revelo Oliver's R-E-V-I-L-O, capital O-L-I-V-E-R, Capel is capital C-A-P-E-L-L, Revelo Oliver, a key John Bircher. Continuing, these men, like Willoughby himself, were close to Army intelligence rather than the CIA. But the ICDCC also included Jose Ignacio Rasco, R-A-S-C-O, the Cuban emigre Secretary General of the MDC, which, as we have seen, was part of the CIA-DIA Manuel Artime Nicaraguan invasion scheme, and to that end had established a training camp on Lake Pontchartrain near New Orleans. So now, taking a look here at what we've seen, Nelson Bunker Hunt, again, who helped pay for the black-bordered ad accusing President Kennedy of treason that appeared in the Dallas Morning News of 11/22/63, he is the Texas representative of a German-based intelligence network, the ICDCC. Among the key members of this are former General Charles Willoughby, who was in charge of Douglas MacArthur's military intelligence for a long period of time, ranging from just before World War II through the Korean War. In our Aryan Nation series, we took a look at Charles Willoughby, named Karl Adolf von Cheppe und Wiedenbach, a German-born fascist whose political idol was Francisco Franco. After his retirement from the military, Charles Willoughby became an advisor to Franco, the fascist dictator of Spain, whose rise to power during the Spanish Civil War was actively aided by Hitler and Mussolini. And we took a look at how also Willoughby brought Franco to the United States to lecture at West Point. We'll also take a look here and take the note of the fact that this particular German-based intelligence network intersects very deeply with the Galen anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations milieu, which we are focusing on this evening. Note that one of the former chairmen of the ICDCC was Hermann Punder. Now, Hermann Punder, of course, or as explained here, was a former Abwehr agent and very close to Galen's, that's Reinhard Galen's supporters Konrad Adenauer, and Hermann Abs of the Deutsche Bank. Now, Hermann Abs was a member of the board of directors of IG Farben, the Nazi chemical cartel, was one of the most important financiers of the Third Reich, and an individual whose influence extends well through the post-World War II period. By the way, he was called in by Pope John Paul I to help straighten out the Vatican banking mess. And take note of something we covered in Radio Free America number 2, that Konrad Adenauer, despite his alleged anti-Nazi sympathies, was in fact deeply involved with the Third Reich, though not a member of the Nazi Party himself. Adenauer and Hermann Abs helped to sponsor Reinhard Galen. Take note also of Theodor Oberlander, Oberlaender. He was a key SS officer and also an individual who was the liaison, or one of the key liaison people between Reinhard Galen's Fremde Heere Ost, or Foreign Armies East, and the Vlasov Liberation Army, the Russian turncoats who fought on behalf of the Third Reich. Elements of the Vlasov Army then jumped to the CIA and U.S. intelligence with the Galen organization. We're going to take a look at Theodor Oberlander and some of his interesting connections later on in the program. Now, take a look, note briefly that Theodor Oberlander, in addition to being a key member of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, Theodor Oberlander was also the commander of the Einsatzgruppe Nachtigall. That was one of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads, which followed the Third Reich's frontline troops into the former Soviet Union and performed many of the liquidations of Jews, Gypsies, Communists, and other people that they sought to get rid of. The Einsatzgruppe Nachtigall liquidated the Jewish population of the city of Lvov, or Lemberg, as it was called when it was part of Poland. And that particular Einsatzgruppe, and the Nachtigall, commanded by Theodor Oberlander, as we looked at in Radio Free America 14, was composed almost entirely of Ukrainian fascists affiliated with the OUN-UPA, also a key element of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations and the World Anti-Communist League. The main patron, the main element, the main figure, I should say, involved with the OUN-UPA was a fellow named Stefan Bandera, B-A-N-D-E-R-A. Remember the name Stefan Bandera, the person we looked at in both RFAs 14 and 15, because we're going to come back to Stefan Bandera later in the program. And also bear in mind something that I cited last week, the Warren Commission Council, who was in charge with investigating the White Russian and the Russian connections, the Galen ABN connections to the milieu of Lee Harvey Oswald, and they were pivotal, as we've seen. This was a fellow named Wesley Liebler, L-I-E-B-L-E-R, who was an attorney with Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn, one of the main American foreign policy law firms. It's interesting to observe, quote, networking in this regard, because the fellow who was instrumental in bringing many of the OUN-UPA Bandera people to the United States, and we looked at this in Radio Free America number 1, so that the former Galen people could work with Galen in the CIA, was none other than a former Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, Frank Wisner, of the Office of Policy Coordination, last name W-I-S-N-E-R. Now, Wisner had been a senior partner with Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn at the same time that William Harding Jackson, another Deputy Director of Central Intelligence at the same time, was also a senior Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn partner. And Wesley Liebler, in charge with investigating the White Russian connections to the assassination, was also an attorney with Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn. Obviously, Wesley Liebler was less than successful in penetrating the significance of all of these connections. And bear in mind, too, something I cited last week, people react very stupidly and instinctively when they hear the word conspiracy. People saying, "Oh, I don't believe in conspiracy theories." Try a different word. Try networking, because that's really what we're looking at. And again, I refer people to the book The Old Boys by Burton Hirsch, last name H-E-R-S-H, which deals with the intersection between the Wall Street elite and the CIA and how this, quote, networking operates. People hear the word conspiracy and they get stupid, but when people hear the word networking, they go, "Oh, networking. Oh, you mean like what yuppies do? You mean like what I do? Why, yes, how nice." Much more intelligent word than conspiracy, much more revealing, and I think much more useful for our purposes under the circumstances in investigating the, quote, networking, unquote, which was very important to understanding the truth concerning the assassination of President Kennedy. We're going to take a musical break now, and then we're going to come back with more of Radio Free America program number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War. What we're going to look at next is the operational cooperation, I guess one would say, between some of the petroleum industry-linked southern reactionary elements in the United States. We're talking about the Hunt, Walker, John Birch Society elements that we've been talking about. And as we've seen, they intersect. They had formed an ideological and operational link with some of the petroleum industry intelligence Galen-linked milieu that we have also explored in the context of the assassination of John Kennedy. Now, I also want to underscore something that I will not have time to get to this evening. There is much more to this milieu than simply the elements that we are looking at. We're also talking about elements of the defense industry and major mainstream American political elements as well as the intelligence community and the military. Obviously, we're looking at the intelligence community tonight, but the milieu that was involved in killing President Kennedy and the milieu that is in control of our political fortunes to this day is larger than just the elements that we're looking at this evening, but these are some of the primary elements. And one of the reasons that I'm taking a look at the link-up between John Birch Society, Hunt, Walker elements, and some of these Third Reich alumni is that these elements actively collaborated in the assassination of John Kennedy, and that link-up between the American far right and these Third Reich alumni is, well, that link-up is not only important, but it seems to me that has to scare the living hell out of anybody with any kind of smarts, because these are the elements that are in control of our lives today. In order to look at how these elements collaborated in the assassination of John Kennedy, and we've been looking at the link-ups between these elements, we're going to turn once again to the Dallas Conspiracy by Peter Dale Scott. Much of the information that I'm about to set forth is also covered in a miscellaneous archive show entitled Edwin Walker, Lee Harvey Oswald, and the Fourth Reich. Turning now to the Dallas Conspiracy. Now, bear in mind that one of the central elements in the Warren Commission's thesis was that Lee Harvey Oswald was not politically motivated in his alleged assassination of John Kennedy because he also fired at Major General Edwin Walker. Now, Walker had been a divisional commander in Germany. He was relieved by President Kennedy of his command for obliging his troops to study the Blue Book of the John Birch Society. This was in direct contravention of military regulations. Oswald supposedly fired at Edwin Walker on April 10th of 1963. The Warren Commission did not go into why Lee Harvey Oswald was able to do what no marksman has ever been able to duplicate, namely getting off two accurate shots at a moving target at a distance of about 90 yards in 6 seconds, and why he happened to miss Edwin Walker, who was stationary sitting on the front porch of his house. As we shall see, the notion that Oswald shot at Walker is one of the most preposterous of the many absurdities presented by the Warren Commission. But what's interesting here is to take a look at how the story of Edwin Walker having supposedly been fired at by Lee Harvey Oswald was developed. Now, bear in mind something that we covered earlier in the broadcast. The white Russian community, this intelligence petroleum Galen milieu that we're looking at, and bear in mind that George Bush was part of this milieu, this particular milieu severed contact with the Oswalds from mid-April of 63 until 11/22. So let's take a look at the alleged shooting by Lee Harvey Oswald at Edwin Walker. Peter Dale Scott writes, in the Dallas conspiracy, the Warren Commission, among its other failings, never established how it was possible for a neo-Nazi newspaper in Munich, which phoned General Edwin Walker at a Shreveport hotel on November 23, 1963, the day after the assassination, to learn that Oswald was the man who had shot at Walker on April 10th. The newspaper, the Deutsche Nationalzeitung und Soldatenzeitung, published this information in its issue of November 29th. Yet, as the report itself makes clear, quote, the FBI had no knowledge that Oswald was responsible for the attack until Marina Oswald revealed the information on December 3rd, unquote. When General Walker was unable to explain this access to Marina's secret, Commission Attorney Wesley Liebler, Jr. himself attempted to explain the paradox by suggesting that the newspaper had been, quote, post-dated, unquote, or, in an even clumsier effort to correct this absurdity, quote, predated, unquote. Of course, we took a look at Wesley Liebler, Carter Ledyard and Milburn, Wisner, etc., just before the break. Peter Dale Scott continues, in fact, the Soldatenzeitung, as the Commission established, was actually printed on November 25th or 26th. Now, again, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out that if the information was supposedly first surfaced to the FBI on December 3rd, and they told the Warren Commission, it obviously is a firm indication of conspiracy that Edwin Walker was able to communicate this information to a German neo-Nazi newspaper on November 23rd, and they were able to publish it on November 29th, days before Marina supposedly revealed the secret. Bear in mind that George de Mohrenschildt corroborated Marina's story, as we looked at earlier. Now, about this particular Munich newspaper, and here we're going to see, with the shooting of the alleged shooting by Lee Harvey Oswald at Edwin Walker, we are going to see the operational link-up between the Southern Rim John Birch Society elements, the linked elements that we've been looking at, and the German-based Galen-linked elements, which are going to come into increasing focus as we proceed in the broadcast. Peter Dale Scott writes, the Munich newspaper with which Walker communicated on November 23rd was linked to the world movement for a second anti-Comintern and also to the American right. In February of 1957, for example, the paper, then called the Deutsche Soldatenzeitung, with several ex-Nazis and SS men on its staff, had collaborated in a complex political intrigue with Fritz Kramer's People's League for Peace and Freedom, the German constituent element in CIAS, of which Kramer was also president. By the way, we're going to come to Fritz Kramer, that's C-R-A-M-E-R, later in the program. The paper's editor, Gerhard Frey, F-R-E-Y, is a close political friend of the proto-Nazi Witiko League, W-I-T-I-K-O, a Sudeten revanchist group which in turn maintains close relations with the ABN and with the BHE Refugee Party of APACL delegate Dr. Theodor Oberlander. Frey's paper publishes a refugee paper, Der Sudetendeutsche, for the Witiko League, and in 1958, Walter Becker, B-E-C-H-E-R, the Witiko League chairman and Bavarian chief of the BHE, made a triumphant tour of U.S. right-wing circles. His views were published by such well-known American rightists as Dallas FBI veteran Dan Smoot, S-M-O-O-T, Army intelligence veteran Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's former intelligence chief, and the American Mercury, whose subsequent military editor in 1963 was General Edwin Walker. Walker himself, in his interview with the Soldatenzeitung, sent special greetings to his German friend, Dr. Frey. By the way, Gerhard Frey later became affiliated with a German neo-Nazi group called the Sportgruppe Hoffmann, one of whose key operatives was a fellow named Ottfried Hepp, who we've looked at in connection with Abu Abbas's Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Achille Lauro hijacking, and Mansour el-Qassar. Well, as if the notion that somehow Edwin Walker could have divined that it was Lee Harvey Oswald who had shot at him days before Marina supposedly revealed this information to the world, proof of the absurdity of the Warren Commission's contention that Lee Harvey Oswald shot at Edwin Walker is found in an examination of the physical evidence in the Walker shooting. Again, turning it to The Dallas Conspiracy by Peter Dale Scott, Scott writes, before December 3rd, there was one publicly identified piece of physical evidence in the Walker shooting, a bullet recovered at the time from the Walker residence. Dallas police and the U.S. press, including Newsweek and the New York Times, had promptly identified the bullet as a .30-06, an identification made so easily it was in the Dallas Morning News only a few hours after the assassination attempt. Right after the Kennedy assassination, both the district attorney and the Dallas policeman who found a rifle in the Texas Book Depository building described it as a 7.65 millimeter Mauser, i.e. a NATO issue calibrated to take .30-06 ammunition. 7.65 millimeters equals .3006 of an inch. Later, both the Dallas police and the Warren Commission systematically denigrated this testimony, since their final story was that the rifle in question was the 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano sold to, quote, A. Hidell, unquote, an alias of Oswald's. The Walker story in the Munich paper is thus compatible with, and probably based on, the short-lived story of the 7.65 millimeter Mauser. The Warren report still maintains that Oswald possessed only one rifle, a 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano, which he used against both Walker and Kennedy. What then of the Walker bullet, which the Dallas police had easily identified as, quote, .30.06 in April? It was now so, quote, badly mutilated, unquote, that the Dallas City County Investigation Laboratory could not determine, quote, the type of weapon which fired the bullet, unquote. The FBI, using more sophisticated techniques, determined that the bullet supplied it by the Dallas police, quote, was a 6.5 millimeter bullet, unquote, instead of a 7.65 millimeter, and microscopic tests revealed further that the general rifling characteristics of the Mannlicher Carcano, quote, are of the same type as those found on the bullet, unquote. Whereas the bullet once was identified by the initials of Patrolman B. Norvell, N-O-R-V-E-L-L, who found it, it now carried the last name of Lieutenant J.C. Day, D-A-Y, the same man who removed the alleged rifle of Oswald from the Texas Book Depository. Commission Exhibit 573, the, quote, shrinking bullet, unquote, is physical evidence suggesting a conspiracy to suppress the true facts about the assassination. Now, my guess is, interjecting, that failure analysis of Menlo Park will not deal with this particular aspect of the Warren Commission's thesis. And again, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to figure out that this is clearly ridiculous. We're looking at it here, however, in order to observe the operational functioning of the Southern Rim reactionary elements grouped around the Hunt family, John Birch Society, and H.L. Hunt protege Edwin Walker, and some of these German-based Galen elements, an extension of which were instrumental in handling the Oswalds in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Now, a few of the names that we're going to be looking at greater length here are a fellow named Fritz Kramer, C-R-A-M-E-R, not to be confused with another German-born Fritz Kramer who became the plans officer for the United States Army from 1949 to 70. Two of his proteges were Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig. Bear in mind that the same organization, the Deutsche Nationalzeitung und Soldatenzeitung of Gerhard Frey, with several former ex-Nazis and SS-men on its staff, was very close to the aforementioned Theodor Oberlander. Now, also note that they were involved with a fellow named Walter Becker, who headed up the Witiko League, a group of revanchist Germans looking to restore the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia, to the Germans. That had been appropriated by Adolf Hitler in one of his first acts of territorial aggression. Note also that Walter Becker had made what Peter Dale Scott describes as a triumphant tour of American right-wing circles and was hailed by such people as Dan Smoot, one of the prime movers of the American far right in the 50s and 60s, people like the aforementioned General Charles Willoughby, who we're going to be looking at again in a couple of minutes, and they enjoyed tremendous support from these elements. That is to say, Becker and the Witiko League. We went into this, by the way, in Radio Free America program number 11, and I would note here that among the supporters of Walter Becker was then Senator Prescott Bush Sr., the close friend of William Casey, Reagan's campaign manager and CIA director throughout much of the 80s. And, of course, we took a look at Prescott Bush Sr. and his involvement with the transatlantic industrial and financial axis that supported Hitler and Mussolini. And we also took a look at some of the networking involved between Prescott Bush and some of the Yale CIA elements that may very well have been involved with getting George Bush into the CIA. Also, take note of the fact that among the many absolute absurdities, physical impossibilities, was the 7.65 millimeter Mauser bullet, which was clearly identified by numerous sources, which then mysteriously metamorphosed into a 6.5 millimeter Carcano round in order to conform to the Warren Commission's thesis. Note also that whereas initially that bullet carried the initials of Patrolman B. Norvell, later on it carried the initials Lieutenant J.C. Day, who was the individual who found that particular rifle in the Texas School Book Depository. The Walker shooting is among the many absolutely absurd elements of the many, many absurdities in the Warren Commission's thesis. We're looking at it here, however, in order to gain an historical understanding of the forces which conspired not only to destroy President Kennedy, but those forces have been ascendant in the political world in the years since, and they are triumphant in the world today. Again, we're looking at the petroleum intelligence milieu as the breeding ground for this active cooperation, both ideological and operational, between elements of the American right, elements of the U.S. national security establishment, and many of the Third Reich alumni who we've been looking at in connection with the Galen anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations-related elements. What are we going to look at now? Again, turning to a long section of the Dallas Conspiracy, and this, by the way, was covered in Radio Free America program number 15. I'm going to review and analyze it here as part of the program. We're now going to take a look at the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, what it is, what the World Anti-Communist Conference for Freedom and Liberation was. We're going to take a look at how this particular organization, the WACCFL, the seed group for what later became known as the World Anti-Communist League, we're going to take a look at how this particular organization represented a reconstitution of the anti-Comintern organization put together by Adolf Hitler and Joseph Goebbels in the Third Reich. The anti-Comintern was a worldwide consortium of fascist groups that was utilized to a very successful degree by the Third Reich, not only for propaganda, but also for intelligence purposes. And basically, as Professor Scott discusses here, the WACCFL was essentially the reconstitution of the anti-Comintern movement, the Comintern being the International Communist Organization of Joseph Stalin. Hitler and Goebbels were very successful in marketing fascism as an antidote to communism, I should say, and this was, the anti-Comintern was the organization that they used. I want listeners to take note of the continuity between elements involved in the original anti-Comintern and elements involved in the WACCFL, which became the World Anti-Communist League, the second anti-Comintern, because this organization essentially represents a reconstitution of major political elements and operational elements of the Third Reich. Turning now, once again, to The Dallas Conspiracy by Peter Dale Scott. He writes, "One can look more closely at the circumstances of Oswald's return to the United States and see a hidden network behind the apparently, quote, low-level, unquote, personnel who encountered him. In support of the FBI story that it did not meet Oswald in New York, the report, on the basis of ample documentation, informs us that, on arrival, the Oswalds were met, quote, by Spaz T. Raikin, R-A-I-K-I-N, a representative of the Travelers' Aid Society who, quote, helped them through customs, unquote. But Raikin was as unusual a welfare worker as Oswald was a shipping agent. A Taiwan publication of the Asian People's Anti-Communist League, APACL, reveals that Spaz T. Raikin was Secretary General of the American Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Nations Incorporated, AFABN. As such, Raikin was in personal contact with the APACL and thus indeed with the Central Committee of the Kuomintang in Taiwan. Take note, too, that the Fry organization was very close to this organization, as well as close to the aforementioned Theodor Oberlander. Continuing here. If it is true that Rakin met Oswald at the boat, then Oswald would have been in direct contact with a semi-covert and supranational anti-communist organization, one which had strong intelligence connections. This new anti-Comintern, in which both the APACL and ABN were represented, had direct personal links with the abortive international anti-Comintern established by Hitler and Goebbels in the 1930s. The Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, or ABN, with its American lobby, the AF-ABN, was similar to, but slightly to the right of, the CIA-supported Assembly of Captive European Nations, or ACEN, with its U.S. CIA front, the American Friends of the Captive Nations, headed by Christopher Emmett, capital E-M-M-E-T. Whereas the ACEN lobbied for the, quote, liberation, unquote, of Poland, Czechoslovakia, and the rest of the area between the Iron Curtain and the USSR, the ABN also sought the liberation of the Ukraine, Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Idel-Ural, Turkestan, and of other ethnic nationalities inside the 1939 borders of the Soviet Union. I would add, of course, that has since taken place. So let's take a look at what we've seen in this first section. Again, Oswald. Now, bear in mind, Oswald was supposedly a traitor to the United States. One of the things that makes his association, his involvement with the CIA's anti-Castro Cuban milieu in New Orleans, and then with these doctrinaire, hardline fascists and anti-communists in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, petroleum industry and aerospace industry high rollers associated with the Galen organization, was that Oswald was an avowed Marxist who had supposedly defected to the United States with top-secret information, as I said, about our North American radar defense nets as well as the U-2 project, and yet he was not arrested, he was not charged with treason. He comes back to the United States and simply begins moving around with people who are the very ideological polar opposite of what he supposedly was. Oswald was almost certainly a U.S. intelligence operative of some kind who was given a left cover. That left cover, as we shall see, led people involved with the Warren Commission, some of them anyway, to cover up the Kennedy assassination because they were afraid that if the public perceived that a popular president had been assassinated by a communist, that might lead to a Third World War. Now, bear in mind, again, as I've said, this new anti-Comintern, the WACCFL, will represent, as we shall see, it represents a reconstitution of many of the same elements which were involved with Hitler and Goebbels in the first anti-Comintern prior to and during the Second World War. And bear in mind, too, now this is very important, that the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, in contrast with the NTS, the Solidarists, also a Russian emigre organization which fought with the Third Reich and worked with U.S. intelligence following the Galen jump to the CIA, the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations sought to break up the Soviet Union into its constituent ethnic republics, whereas the NTS sought to simply eliminate communism and to retain the territorial integrity of the former Soviet Union. Now, as we shall see later on in the program, the operational methodology and tactics of the NTS, the Solidarists, were involved infiltrating and turning, in effect, the Soviet Army. And the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations sought the breaking up of the Soviet Union. What we're going to be looking at is the successful prosecution by U.S. intelligence involving some of these same elements of the NTS methodology, infiltrating and turning the Soviet Union's national security apparatus and the Army in particular, and the realization of the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations' political goals, namely the breakup of the Soviet Union into its constituent ethnic republics. This has now happened. I would note, too, that the RUK organization, which is the dominant Ukrainian nationalist organization, looks for its inspiration to Stefan Bandera of the aforementioned OUN-UPA, a key element of the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations. And Russian President Boris Yeltsin is very close to something called the Free Congress Foundation, founded by Heritage Foundation founder Paul Weyrich, one of the guiding lights of the American far right. And I would note that the Free Congress Foundation, as we looked at in Radio Free America program number 36, is deeply involved with the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations. The director of its Eastern European operations is a fellow named Laszlo Pastor, P-A-S-Z-T-O-R, who, as we shall see, was a member of the Arrow Cross organization, the Hungarian fascist organization that fought alongside Hitler during World War II. And the ABN is very close to Boris Yeltsin, acting through the Free Congress Foundation. So in a very real sense, we can see in the present makeup of what was the former Soviet Union the realization of the goal of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, again, as we have seen, put together by Adolf Hitler in 1943. Continuing now with the Dallas Conspiracy by Peter Dale Scott. At the heart of the ABN alliance were the resources of two actual post-war underground movements, the Hungarian Freedom Fighters and the Ukrainian OUN, or Underground Army. By 1960, however, the ABN had come to concentrate on psychological and political warfare. Thus, it competed with Russian émigré organizations such as the NTS, to be discussed shortly. I would interject, we've already discussed that, for places in U.S.-supported Psy-war activities like Radio Liberation, later renamed Radio Liberty, in Munich. It also participated in planning for a grand world alliance of world anti-communist forces to be called the World Anti-Communist Congress for Freedom and Liberation, or WACCFL, whose composition is indicated by the 15-man steering committee elected at a preparatory conference in Mexico City in March of 1958. The Mexico City conference was itself called in response to the Taipei statement of an international group meeting in October of 1957 in Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek of Taiwan, Syngman Rhee, R-H-E-E, of South Korea, and Diem of South Vietnam were each represented in this steering committee by a top figure in their respective party apparatus. German veterans of Hitler's frustrated anti-Comintern and Ostpolitik programs were included, notably Fritz Kramer, C-R-A-M-E-R, of the CIAS, the Committee for Information and Social Activity, a former officer of the Abwehr in Riga and Lisbon from 1939 to 45. Alfred Gielen, G-I-E-L-E-N, not to be confused, by the way, with Reinhard Gehlen, CIAS Secretary General, and a former Nazi publicist for Goebbels' anti-Comintern, became the WACCFL Steering Committee's Regional Secretary for Europe. And in a footnote to that passage, Peter Dale Scott adds, in the 1950s, Kramer was also president of Eberhard Taubert's, T-A-U-B-E-R-T, Volksbund für Frieden und Freiheit, or VFF, an industry-financed private vigilance group to ferret out and maintain files on German leftists. Taubert, the head of Division Pro 2 in Goebbels' propaganda ministry, had, quote, prided himself on being the wire puller behind the anti-Comintern, unquote. And in another footnote, Peter Dale Scott adds, Alfred B. Gielen, Das Rotbuch über Spanien, Berlin, Nibelungen Verlag, 1937, published for the anti-Comintern under a large swastika. Taubert was the political director of the Nibelungen publishing house. And continuing with Peter Dale Scott's text here, the American representatives were veteran China lobbyist Charles Edison, E-D-I-S-O-N, of the John Birch Society and American Security Council, and Lev Dobriansky, D-O-B-R-I-A-N-S-K-Y, a Ukrainian-American Army Reserve officer and professor at Georgetown University with close links to Army intelligence circles. The ABN had 2 of the 15 seats on the World Committee, 1 less than Latin America. Its representatives were Yaroslav Stetsko, S-T-E-T-Z-K-O, briefly a premier of the short-lived Ukrainian Republic at the time of the 1941 German invasion, and Ferenc Farkas, F-A-R-K-A-S, the ABN military chief who commanded the army of Arrow Cross Chief Ferenc Zalasi, S-Z-A-L-A-S-I, executed as a war criminal against the Russians in World War II. By the way, Ferenc is spelled F-E-R-E-N-C. Now let's pause for just a minute to analyze some of the forces that we're looking at here. And again, we're looking at an element which, as we shall see, had hooked up with the American far right and the American national security establishment in order to help assassinate President Kennedy. Now, by way of analyzing, I really should say, the forces that we've been looking at, note again now, as we take a look at the composition of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, two of the main elements were the Hungarian freedom fighters, which descended from the Arrow Cross organization of fascist Hungary, and the OUN-UPA organization of Stefan Bandera, whom we've already discussed, and who we're going to be looking at in a big way a little bit later in the broadcast. By the way, I would mention that in addition to Germany, Italy, and Japan, the Axis nations of World War II also included Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, as well as, for a time, Finland, something unfortunately a lot of people do not know. Now note that the ABN competed with the NTS, the Solidarists, whom we've already looked at, including Igor Voshinin, one of Marina Oswald's handlers after the assassination of one of the people who helped extract false testimony from Marina Oswald. The NTS and the ABN collaborated in the WACCFL, which is to become the World Anti-Communist League. Later, however, the ABN, which did not wish to retain the territorial integrity of the old Russian Empire, drove out the NTS, but all of them worked with the Asian People's Anti-Communist League of the nationalist Chinese government of Chiang Kai-shek. By the way, we took a look at the distinct fascist affiliations of the nationalist Chinese and Chiang Kai-shek in Radio Free America program number 11. Now take a look, too, at the reconstitution of the original anti-Comintern put together by Hitler and Goebbels in this second anti-Comintern. Take note of a fellow who was very close to Gerhard Frey, the fellow with whom Edwin Walker communicated and with whom he spoke to communicate the information about Lee Harvey Oswald, having supposedly fired at him, that on November 23rd of '63, when Marina Oswald had supposedly disclosed this for the first time on December 3rd. One of the people we look at here is Fritz Kramer, an Abwehr agent, a Third Reich military intelligence agent in both Riga in what is now Latvia, as well as in Lisbon of Portugal. Now, Fritz Kramer and his organization, the CIAS, basically is a proto-Nazi political activist organization in Germany, or was. He, in turn, was very active on behalf of an organization called VFF, which kept files on German leftists and which sought to ferret them out so they would not participate in key German industry, defense industry in particular. Now, Eberhard Taubert was actually a member of the Pro-2 Goebbels propaganda ministry and was deeply involved with the original anti-Comintern of the Third Reich. Note also that the Secretary General of Fritz Kramer's CIAS organization is a fellow named Alfred Gielen, again, G-I-E-L-E-N. Don't confuse that with Reinhard Gehlen. And he also worked with Goebbels' anti-Comintern movement. He became the WACCFL Regional Secretary for Europe, and he published for the Nibelungen Publishing House that was owned and headed up by Eberhard Taubert of the VFF, who also worked with Fritz Kramer. And so again, what we're looking at here is an actual reconstitution of significant elements of the original anti-Comintern movement, and this organization in turn hooks up with the American far-right elements of our intelligence system, national security establishment, the petroleum industry, and that's the milieu we're looking at here. And this organization, this milieu, I should say, becomes the ascendant political entity in the United States and then the world, and it is explicitly fascist. And bear in mind again that George Bush was deeply involved with this milieu, if not the actual assassination of John Kennedy. Now, take note here, too, of a few other names and organizations. First of all, take note of the American Security Council, which is very close to the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations. We're going to go back to that very shortly. One of the people that was involved in the original WACCFL conference was Charles Edison of the American Security Council. Also take note of Lev Dobryansky, a Ukrainian-American who was another key member of the WACCFL planning session. Lev Dobryansky later became Ronald Reagan's ambassador to the Bahamas, and his daughter, Paula Dobryansky, and again last name D-O-B-R-I-A-N-S-K-Y, sat on Reagan's National Security Council with Oliver North. Yaroslav Stetsko was for a time the head of a short-lived independent Ukraine under Third Reich auspices. Later, the Third Reich formally took over that organization. But the Yaroslav Stetsko, also very close to the OUN-UPA, and we've taken a look at how Theodor Oberlander, another key player in the situation we're looking at, was head of the Einsatzgruppe Nachtigall, which liquidated the ghetto of Lvov/Lemberg. And bear in mind that that particular organization was headed up, or was composed largely of Ukrainian fascists from the OUN-UPA, and again, many of them brought to the United States by the Office of Policy Coordination, headed up by Deputy Director of CIA Frank Wisner. He was Deputy DCI at the same time that another senior partner in Carter Ledyard Milburn, the aforementioned William Harding Jackson, was also a Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, and Wesley Liebler, in charge with the Warren Commission counsel and charged with investigating these connections, was also from Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn. And again, the word networking and the book The Old Boys by Burton Hirsch is recommended under the circumstances. Take note also of the presence of Arrow Cross veteran Ferenc Farkas on the steering committee, the WACCFL planning session, and bear in mind again that another veteran of the fascist Arrow Cross organization, Laszlo Pastor, became the director for Eastern European activities of the Free Congress Foundation, which is very close to and intimately involved with the political fortunes of the Boris Yeltsin, currently the president of the independent Russia. Continuing now with Peter Dale Scott's essay, actually not essay, monograph. By 1962, both the new anti-Comintern movement and the American Friends of the ABN in particular were profoundly dissatisfied with the Kennedy State Department. Dean Rusk, Kennedy's Secretary of State, in opposing the demands of the AF-ABN and allied groups for a permanent Congressional Captive Nations Committee, went out of his way to refer to Ukraine, Armenia, and Georgia not as, quote, nations, unquote, but as, quote, traditional parts of the Soviet Union, unquote. Rusk did not want the U.S., quote, in the undesirable position of seeming to advocate the dismemberment of an historical state, unquote. This Rusk letter, like other features of the Kennedy administration's Russian policy, was repeatedly polemicized against by ABN and other emigre elements, including a sympathetic veteran of Army intelligence, Charles Willoughby, of the American Security Council. Recall, interrupting here, that he, of course, was MacArthur's intelligence chief for many years, again, a German-born fascist who, after his retirement, became an advisor to Francisco Franco, the fascist dictator of Spain. Continuing now with Peter Dale Scott's text, was Oswald ignored by the FBI and New York City and instead met and cared for by SPA's T. Reagan, the Secretary General of the AF-ABN? So the report would have us believe, but a simpler and less conspiratorial explanation, albeit unprovable, is that Reagan was himself some kind of agent either for the FBI or some analogous agency such as the CIA or Army intelligence. If he was not, then the contact and/or surveillance which one would expect from the FBI had somehow been delegated to a member of a right-wing political organization which, despite its intelligence connections, was directly engaged in a bitter polemic with the Kennedy administration. This polemic dealt with the issue of, quote, rolling back communism in Europe, unquote, but excuse me, one more time. This polemic dealt not only with the issue of, quote, rolling back, unquote, communism in Eastern Europe, but also with the politically related issues of a permanent Volunteer Freedom Corps, or U.S.-supported Foreign Legion, a permanent Freedom Academy for training in psychological warfare, and a permanent Captive Nations Committee of the U.S. Congress. On the first two issues, the AF-ABN position was also lobbied for vigorously by the APACL, and also in America by the American Security Council, a private coalition of industrialists and intelligence veterans which had been set up in 1955 by ex-agents of the FBI. The American Security Council, like Fritz Kramer's sister outfit in West Germany, the VFF, ran security checks on individuals seeking employment in private industry. Its index of over 1 million alleged subversives, quote-unquote, was based on the anti-Semitic files of Harry A. Jung's American Vigilant Intelligence Federation, which had collaborated with the Goebbels, Taubert, anti-Comintern in the 1930s. Jung, by the way, is J-U-N-G. Continuing. Lev Dobryansky, described in Who's Who as the author of the Congressional Captive Nations Week resolution, and former Army General Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's top intelligence officer, were perhaps the two leading supporters of the ABN and Ukrainian cause. Both men were Republicans associated with former McCarthy aide Robert Morris in the American Security Council and in interlocking right-wing organizations such as the Young Americans for Freedom Advisory Board. Both men opposed the pro-Russian sympathies of the CIA and had connections with the FBI and the Army Reserve, which will figure prominently in the Oswald narrative. By the way, I would note here that pro-Russian here is not to be interpreted as pro-Soviet, but compared with what the ABN wanted, pro-Russian. Now, this probably belongs in quotes. Continuing. Dobryansky, who taught regularly at Georgetown University, also taught at the Army's National War College. In 1958, he was appointed lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserve's 352nd Division for, quote, military government civil affairs, unquote, with responsibilities vaguely reminiscent of the movie, quote, 7 Days in May, unquote. Anthony Buscari, B-O-U-S-C-A-R-R-I, a third pro-ABN spokesman associated with Dobryansky and Willoughby in the American Security Council and the Young Americans for Freedom, attracts our attention because, like Oswald, he served in the Marines. Well, let's pause here and take a look at what we have seen in this particular section of Peter Dale Scott's monograph. Now, again, the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations and this new anti-Comintern, this reincarnation of the Hitler-Goebbels organization of the 30s and 40s, this organization bitterly opposed Kennedy's Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, who went out of his way to recognize the historical or the territorial integrity of the Soviet Union and made a point of indicating that he did not seek to dismantle a, quote, historical entity, i.e. the USSR, formerly the old Russian Empire. Now, of course, the NTS that we've looked at earlier was in agreement with preserving the territorial integrity. The ABN, which originally was a vehicle for Hitler's Ostpolitik, again, formed by Adolf Hitler in 1943, sought the breakup of the Soviet Union into its constituent ethnic republics. Now, one of the main vehicles of ABN support in the United States and one of the major links between American reactionary political culture and the World Anti-Communist League is the American Security Council, an organization, by the way, deeply involved with the Reagan administration. The American Security Council, recall, functions very much like the VFF and CIAS of Fritz Kramer and Eberhard Taubert. Again, Eberhard Taubert was actually a veteran, one of the main organizers of the anti-Comintern, and in turn, one of his employees, Alfred Gielen, was the regional secretary for the WACCFL and also worked with Fritz Kramer in the CIAS. Now, the American Security Council's index of, quote, subversives, numbering a million, were based on the anti-Semitic files of Harry A. Jung's American Vigilant Intelligence Federation, which had collaborated, again, with the Goebbels-Taubert anti-Comintern. So we see the American Security Council here, again, involving Lev Dobryansky and people like Charles Willoughby, the fascist who had been MacArthur's intelligence chief. We see the American Security Council growing out of an organization, an American fascist organization, which had actually been an American touchdown point for the first anti-Comintern. So on both sides of the Atlantic, with Fritz Kramer / Eberhard Taubert / Alfred Gielen in the VFF CIAS, as well as with the corresponding organization, the ASC, based on Harry A. Jung's American Vigilant Organization, we see reconstituted on both sides of the Atlantic original elements of Hitler's and Goebbels' anti-Comintern from the 1930s. I would also take note that Lev Dobryansky was a lieutenant colonel in the Army Reserve's 352nd Division for Military and Government Civil Affairs. This basically was a martial law contingency group, which, as Professor Scott has noted here, had responsibilities vaguely reminiscent of the novel 7 Days in May about an abortive military coup in the United States. As we looked at in the Guns of November and other broadcasts, the Kennedy assassination, the assassination of President Kennedy, was a successful military coup. Now again, we're looking at these elements and I'm analyzing them in detail so that we can come to understand the nature of the historical forces which destroyed President Kennedy and which came into ascendance in the world as a result. And we can see in the breakup, the territorial dissolution of the former Soviet Union, the realization of the goal, the operational goal of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations. And although Hitler originally sought to dominate the entire Soviet Union and control it, because according to Nazi racial theory, Slavs were viewed as inferior, later, particularly after the German army began to suffer the enormous casualties and the attrition on the Eastern Front, Theodor Oberlander, again, the person we've looked at earlier, among others, helped to form a revised Ostpolitik for the Third Reich, and the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations was instrumental in this. This sought to enlist various Russian ethnic minorities in the German war effort as soldiers in return for a promise of independence after the war. The various constituent ethnic republics of the Soviet Union were to be granted their independence. They would simply be satellite states and fascist cooperative states of the Third Reich. What we're going to look at now is the role of the WACCFL in helping to create the myth that Lee Harvey Oswald was a Soviet agent and that therefore the assassination of President Kennedy was performed by the Soviet Union. This was instrumental in helping to oblige some members of the Warren Commission to cover up the truth about the Kennedy assassination, because again, the official version is absolutely ludicrous, as we've seen and as we looked at in our other programs. But the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald had been given a left cover and linked with the Soviet Union and Castro led many people to cover the assassination up, because they felt that if the truth came out about President Kennedy's assassination, it would lead to a Third World War. We're going to touch briefly now on an article in a magazine called Tikkun, T-I-K-K-U-N. This, once again, will feature Peter Dale Scott. By the way, research credit on this belongs to a listener. We're going to touch briefly now on an article in a magazine called Tikkun, T-I-K-K-U-N. This, once again, will feature Peter Dale Scott. By the way, research credit on this belongs to a listener. And Peter Dale Scott discusses the role of the left cover given Oswald in instrumenting necessitating the cover-up in an article. This is an interview with Tikkun's editors, and it's called "The Assassination and the Cover-Up: What Really Happened," an interview between Tikkun's editors and Peter Dale Scott. Scott replies to Tikkun, skipping well down into the interview, "I can prove that there were many arrangements and conspiracies to cover up who killed Kennedy. Some of these were almost certainly benign, such as the motives of Earl Warren, who, when he accepted the position as chair of the investigating commission, spoke of the need to avoid World War III. But there were also people who conspired before the assassination to link Lee Harvey Oswald to the KGB. And those people were largely grouped around the WACCFL, and we're going to take a look at that right now. Now, bear in mind again the name of Stefan Bandera. One of the things that we looked at in Radio Free America program number 15 was the assassination of Stefan Bandera. Bandera, again, had been a Ukrainian fascist working for an independent, albeit fascist, Ukraine. He worked very closely with the Third Reich and with Galen's Fremde Ost. He then jumped to the CIA with Galen. He had also begun to work with British intelligence, and Reinhard Galen basically had never forgiven the British for fighting against Nazi Germany. Galen was extremely jealous of his operatives, and the available evidence suggests that even though the official version of Stefan Bandera's assassination is that he was killed by a KGB assassin named Bogdan Stashinsky, S-T-A-S-H-Y-N-S-K-Y, in fact, the available evidence suggests that Stashinsky was actually a double agent for Galen. Stefan Bandera was killed on October 15, 1959, by the way. That was the exact same date that Lee Harvey Oswald first, quote, defected, unquote, to Russia. The assassination of Stefan Bandera, performed apparently with a specialized weapon which fired a cyanide gas pellet, which then killed the victim, in this case Bandera, using cyanide gas. The killing went unsolved for a year and a half. Then Bogdan Stashinsky supposedly defected to the West, or he came over to the West, and he had in his pocket a broken key, the shaft for a key, which, upon examination, turned out to match exactly the broken half, the other half, which was still lodged. Now, we're talking a year and a half later, still lodged in the lock of Stefan Bandera's apartment. Now, when dealing with the intelligence community, it's important to understand the resources and the methodology and the operational techniques of a modern intelligence agency. If a key operative like Stefan Bandera had been assassinated, any modern intelligence agency would cover absolutely every square inch of information in order to find out what had happened, or every square inch of territory. It would have gained all of the information it needed in order to find out just exactly what had happened with this particular assassination. Now, the notion that this particular key, broken off from its shaft, could have remained in the lock of Stefan Bandera's apartment for a year and a half, and then along comes Bogdan Stashinsky, along comes Jones, so to speak, and says, look what I've got here in my pocket, a broken key, and then the Galen organization goes, whoops, look what we found, here's the other half of that broken key, goddamn, you must be the assassin of Stefan Bandera. Although this might appear to be nitpicking to the uninitiated observer, any trained student of intelligence activity could recognize this as a very obvious okey-doke from the day one. So the available evidence, it was not airtight, but the available evidence suggests very strongly that, as E.H. Cookridge suggests in Galen Spy of the Century, Galen was jealous of Bandera's work with the British, although he sticks, Cookridge does, with the official Bogdan Stashinsky KGB assassination theory. Later, the KGB produced a Galen turncoat who said that, in fact, Stashinsky was working for Galen as a double agent, and that Galen had assassinated Stefan Bandera. The okey-doke with the broken key suggests that that was the more probable explanation. What we're going to take a look at now is the efforts both before and after the assassination of President Kennedy by elements of the WACCFL, this reconstituted anti-Comintern, this second anti-Comintern, which in 1967 would formally coalesce as the World Anti-Communist League, a major vehicle of American covert operation and foreign policy in the succeeding years, very much involved with the Ronald Reagan administration. What we're going to see now is the WACCFL's efforts in painting Oswald red as a KGB/Castro assassin, and this led many of the people on the Warren Commission, including Earl Warren, who spoke of the need to avoid World War III, to cover up the fact that there was very, very obviously a conspiracy, because if enough of this communist quote, or Oswald's communist cover disinformation got out, it could precipitate the desire on the part of the American people for an all-out war with the Soviet Union, because Kennedy, despite the extent to which he was despised by the elements that we've been covering this evening, as well as many elements of the American national security establishment, Kennedy was very popular with the American people. Turning now to the WACCFL's attempts to link the assassination of Stefan Bandera with the assassination of John Kennedy, Peter Dale Scott writes as follows. The death in Munich on October 15, 1959, of Ukrainian guerrilla leader Stefan Bandera, allegedly at the hands of Soviet agent Bogdan Stashinsky, was exploited by Ukrainian nationalist and anti-Bolshevik nation spokesmen to demonstrate the importance of their movement to the Soviet authorities, and, more particularly, to oppose the growing rapprochement between the American and Soviet governments. Later, spokesmen for the American right wing sought to link Stashinsky to Oswald, some even speculating that they had both been trained at the same special, quote, Department 13, unquote, school for assassins in Moscow. Curiously, none of these spokesmen observed that the date of Bandera's death, October 15, 1959, was the date Oswald entered Russia. But at least one of these pro-Ukrainian spokesmen, former Representative Charles Kirsten, K-E-R-S-T-E-N, who had succeeded Edison as a member of the World Anti-Communist Steering Committee alluded to earlier, began to develop the picture of a Soviet assassin conspiracy 2 weeks before the assassination. And in an article here from the Philadelphia Daily News, reprinted from the Ukrainian Bulletin of the ABN, and by the way, a fellow named Charles Moser, who's on the editorial board of the Ukrainian Bulletin, also deeply involved with the Free Congress Foundation. We looked at that in Radio Free America 36. This particular article, again, in which Charles Kirsten, who, by the way, was the counsel for Mrs. Bandera at Bogdan Stashinsky's trial, he attempts, and this is 2 weeks before Kennedy's assassination, to link the assassination of Stefan Bandera to a KGB assassination program, which would also result in the KGB assassinating American people in America and American political leaders. The article reads, 15 days before he was shot down, President Kennedy was warned that assassins were being trained in Russia to commit murders in the U.S. and England. This warning was voiced in a letter former Representative Charles Kirsten, Republican of Wisconsin, sent the late president and his brothers, Attorney General Robert Kennedy and Senator Edward Kennedy. The burden of Kirsten's letter was an effort to obtain administration help in focusing public attention on the assassination of Stefan Bandera, the Ukrainian underground leader, by communist agents. In urging this, Kirsten wrote, quote, "The Senate Internal Security Subcommittee has been contemplating a hearing of the killing in Munich of the Ukrainian underground leader Stefan Bandera by the former Soviet agent Bogdan Stashinsky, whose German trial Kirsten attended as counsel for Mrs. Bandera. It was a bizarre assassination, illustrating the subversive operations of the Soviet police in the free world. Apparently, the State Department is trying to prevent the hearing. Before his defection, Stashinsky was being trained for high-level killings in England and the U.S. There are others in such training, according to his testimony." And then Peter Dale Scott resumes his text. 3 or 4 days after the Kennedy assassination, a Munich right-wing newspaper linked to the ABN, the Deutsche Nationalzeitung und Soldatenzeitung, was able to publish the hitherto unrevealed story that Oswald shot at General Walker, and added to it the story that Oswald and Ruby together had been released at the insistence of Robert Kennedy. Either coincidentally or conspiratorially, the press secretary of the World Anti-Communist Congress for Freedom and Liberation Steering Committee added to the picture that Oswald was part of a left-wing assassination plot. The press secretary was Salvador Diaz Verson, D-I-A-Z, capital V-E-R-S-O-N, president of the Liga Anticomunista de Cuba, and a former chief of Cuba's military intelligence service under Prio Sequeras, that's capital P-R-I-O, capital S-O-C-A-R-R-A-S. He helped start an unfounded rumor in Miami that Oswald, while in Mexico City in September of 1963, quote, met the Cuban ambassador in a Mexico City restaurant, and they drove off in the ambassador's car so they could talk privately, unquote. Other Cuban exiles in Miami, in touch with State Department security officers, were at this time spreading rumors about the pro-Castro connections of Jack Ruby. We shall come later to Oswald's apparent link, while in New Orleans in 1963, to Americans who were in touch with the Latin American elements of the WACCFL Steering Committee. Maurice Brooks Gatlin, part of a right-wing group at an address used by Oswald for his Fair Play for Cuba Committee, attended a Congress in 1958 of the Inter-American Confederation for the Defense of the Continent, CIADC, along with the aforementioned Salvador Diaz Verson, Fritz Kramer, Ku Cheng Kang of the APACL, and Nestor Procyk, P-R-O-C-Y-K, the chairman of the American Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations. By the way, that was in 58. Spaz T. Rakin later succeeded him, and he met Oswald at the boat. Continuing, all of this suggests a continuity underlying the significance of Oswald's contact with Spaz T. Rakin in June of 1962. So let's pause and analyze this last section of the Dallas conspiracy. Now, first of all, again, the WACCFL had begun spreading, or elements of it, namely Charles Kirsten, had begun developing a Soviet assassination conspiracy story 2 weeks before the assassination. And again, the Bandera hit was almost certainly performed by the Galen organization. And bear in mind again that Charles Kirsten began developing this story 2 weeks before Kennedy was assassinated. It was then picked up after Kennedy was assassinated to help portray Lee Harvey Oswald as having been trained at the same Department 13 assassination school as Bogdan Stashinsky. And bear in mind again, as we've already seen, Gerhard Fry's newspaper publishes the Walker story in the Deutsche National Zeitung und Piraten-Zeitung, linked to the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations of the WACCFL. Now, bear in mind also that the WACCFL's press secretary, a Cuban fascist and former intelligence chief named Salvador Diaz Verson, began to develop a story after the assassination linking Lee Harvey Oswald to Fidel Castro. Now, bear in mind, too, that Lee Harvey Oswald had been the lone member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, an alleged pro-Castro organization. The address for his literature was 544 Camp Street. This was the same address as the detective agency of Guy Bannister, which had served as a front for the CIA's anti-Castro efforts in New Orleans. And bear in mind that the Cuban Revolutionary Council's office in New Orleans, that being the CIA's anti-Castro Cuban umbrella organization, had been founded by Sergio Arcacha Smith at that address. Arcacha Smith, as we've seen in the recent addendum to the Guns of November Part 3, was directly linked to David Ferry. And by the way, it was former Texas Governor John Connally who refused to extradite Sergio Arcacha Smith to New Orleans for Jim Garrison's investigation. Now, one of Guy Bannister's investigators for the Bannister Detective Agency at the 544 Camp Street, 531 Lafayette Place address, accurately portrayed in the Stone movie, was the aforementioned Maurice Brooks Gatlin Jr., and he was directly in touch with the Latin American elements of the WACCFL and had attended a meeting in 1958 with Salvador Diaz Verson, the press secretary of the WACCFL, developing the Oswald Castro canard, as well as Fritz Kramer, who we've looked at, the Abwehr agent who had been involved with people involved with the first anti-Comintern and then linked up with people involved with the WACCFL, the new anti-Comintern. Also bear in mind that the then Secretary General, this in 1958, of the American Friends of the Anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations, Nestor Prochik, at this same meeting. By the way, Maurice Brooks Gatlin Jr. died in the fall from a Panama hotel window, died when he fell from the window of his Panama hotel room in 1965. I would also note that Maurice Brooks Gatlin Jr., as we looked at in the Guns of November, Maurice Brooks Gatlin Jr. had boasted of carrying a $100,000 payment to the French generals of the secret army organization, the OAS, l'Organisation de l'Armée Secrète, that were involved in trying to assassinate French President Charles de Gaulle. They were irate over his granting of independence to the former French colony of Algeria. Many of those same French generals had been involved with the French fascist movement of Vichy, which collaborated with the Germans. I would also note that one of these key generals, one of the generals in the OAS, and Maurice Brooks Gatlin Jr. testified to having taken $100,000 from the CIA to those generals. One of those generals was a fellow named Raoul Salon, last name S-A-L-A-N, who was protected from extradition for his participation in the attempts on de Gaulle's life by none other than Reinhard Galen. This, by the way, is covered in the aforementioned book, Galen, Spy of the Century. So, again, we're taking a look at people directly involved with Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans, the 544 Camp Street, 531 Lafayette Place address. Again, Maurice Brooks Gatlin, one of Bannister's investigators, deeply involved with this same milieu, the WACCFL, and the ABN elements that we've been looking at, which were involved not only with trafficking Lee Harvey Oswald around in New Orleans, the same milieu, the Galen ABN milieu, was involved with trafficking the Oswalds around in Dallas-Fort Worth, may have been involved with trafficking, handling the Oswalds in the former Soviet Union, and these same elements were involved with generating the false testimony by Marina implicating Lee Harvey Oswald in the Edwin Walker killing. Again, Walker first mentioned that in a call to Gerhard Frey's Deutsche Nationalzeitung und Soldatenzeitung, days before Marina Oswald supposedly revealed that to the world. George Bush associate George de Mohrenschildt corroborated Marina's story, and as we've seen, the WACCFL was instrumental in helping to generate the disinformation concerning Oswald as a KGB/Castro assassin linked to Bogdan Stashinsky in the training, the alleged training by the KGB of Bogdan Stashinsky to assassinate Stefan Bandera. Again, this is a dizzying tangle of connections. It's one of the reasons why I paused to go into this. We're looking at this, again, to understand the nature of the milieu and the political forces which not only killed President Kennedy, but which quite obviously have had a profound effect on the world since. And after a short musical break, we're going to take a look at how the goals of the ABN and the OUN-UPA of Stefan Bandera and the methodology of the NTS, also involved with trafficking around the Oswalds and killing President Kennedy, how these goals have now been realized in the former Soviet Union, and in weeks to come we're going to see how these goals are in the process of being realized in the United States. By the way, take note again of Cuban exiles in Miami, as Peter Dale Scott notes, involved in generating the disinformation that Jack Ruby was connected to Castro. It was George Bush, the associate of George de Mohrenschildt, who was dispatched to gauge the reaction of the Miami anti-Castro Cuban exile community to Kennedy's assassination. One of the questions I have is whether perhaps Bush was involved with generating some of these disinformation attempts. We're going to take a musical break now, and then we're going to come back with the last few minutes of tonight's program, and we're going to tie things up. We will be coming back to this again as we proceed with Radio Free America number 37. Once again, we will be continuing the analysis of the events that we're looking at and the forces that we're looking at over the next several weeks, and that will add historical depth to the development of these forces. We're going to take a look at how the forces that we've just looked at engaged in literally a coup, a fascist coup in the United States, namely the assassination of President Kennedy. We're going to take a look at how these forces developed, and we will take a look at the implications for the United States in weeks to come. The last section of the broadcast this evening, what we're going to be looking at, concerns the way in which this Galen-ABN milieu, which, as we've seen, intersects directly with the intelligence community, with the national security establishment of the United States, with the American far right, John Birch Society, Hunt Walker elements. We're going to take a look at how this particular axis, and I use the term advisedly, developed. This axis developed as a result of not only the incorporation of these Galen-ABN-related elements into the U.S. intelligence system, but specifically as a result of the introduction of these same elements into the political life of the United States, and this under the auspices of American intelligence fronts, CIA fronts, in the United States. That's one of the things we're going to be looking at right now. One of the major points that I want to underscore here is how these forces represent a culmination of the covert action and psychological warfare techniques and political warfare that were developed by the Third Reich during the Second World War, and which were then carried to the United States under the auspices of the Galen Organization and organizations like the NTS and the ABN, and how ultimately they have reached their fulfillment vis-a-vis policy towards the former Soviet Union. And in weeks to come, we're going to see how they are in the process of fulfilling their policy towards the United States. The last section of tonight's program is going to deal with the genesis of rollback or liberation theory. This obviously is represented or incarnated in the persona of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, As we've seen, the Kennedy administration's State Department under Dean Rusk was opposed to this, and as we've also seen, not only in tonight's program, but in particular in Radio Free America 36 and its various addenda, the agenda of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations and the Galen organization has been realized in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. We're now going to read from a book called Blowback, subtitled The First Full Account of America's Recruitment of Nazis and Its Disastrous Effect on Our Domestic and Foreign Policy. This book was authored by Christopher Simpson. It was published in hardcover by Weidenfeld and Nicholson, and it was copyrighted 1988. And of the genesis of rollback or liberation theory, and that particular theory, as opposed to the containment theory of fighting the Cold War, had its genesis not only with some of these Galen ABN-related elements, but specifically they were introduced into American political life through CIA domestic intelligence fronts, and as we shall see, the methodology and the goals of this Galen organization and related elements operating in and through the American national security establishment represents a direct continuity of methodology and goals from the Third Reich's covert action, political and psychological warfare programs. Simpson writes, at the conclusion of Chapter 14, one of the most important characteristics of the war criminals who did come to the United States is that they did not arrive here as isolated individuals. As has been seen in the cases of the Croatian Ustashi, the Ukrainian OUN, and the Latvian Vanagis, V-A-N-A-G-I-S, to name only three. Many of these immigrants were in fact part of experienced, highly organized groups with distinct political agendas that differed little from the fascist programs they had promoted in their homelands. The anti-communist paranoia of the McCarthy period gave these groups fertile soil in which to put down roots and to grow. And then in Chapter 15, entitled The Politics of Liberation, Simpson goes on, the Central Intelligence Agency did not sever its ties with the extremist exile organizations once they had arrived in this country. Instead, it continued to use them in clandestine operations both abroad and in the United States itself. Before the middle of the 1950s, the agency found itself entangled with dozens and probably hundreds of former Nazis and SS men who had fought their way into the leadership of a variety of Eastern European emigre political associations inside this country. Instead of withdrawing its support for the extremist groups and for the men and women who led them, the CIA went to considerable lengths to portray these leaders as legitimate representatives of the countries they had fled. At about the same time that the agency initiated the immigration programs discussed in the last chapter, it dramatically expanded its publicity and propaganda efforts inside the United States itself. A major theme of this effort was to establish the credibility and legitimacy of exiled Eastern European politicians, former Nazi collaborators and non-collaborators alike, in the eyes of the American public. Through the National Committee for a Free Europe, or NCFE, and a new CIA finance group, the Crusade for Freedom, or CFF, the Covert Operations Division of the agency became instrumental in introducing into the American political mainstream many of the right-wing extremist emigre politicians' plans to, quote, liberate, unquote, Eastern Europe and to, quote, roll back communism, unquote. Skipping ahead in Chapter 15, Simpson writes, although it was little known in the United States at the time, the genesis of the liberation philosophy can be clearly traced to emigre propagandists who had worked for the Nazis on the Eastern Front during World War II. After the war, the various conservative and liberal anti-communist organizations in the United States that adopted liberation as a rallying cry added new and specifically American elements to the program that altered the earlier German strategy in basic ways. Liberation, in its American version, included an insistence that the anti-communist revolutions be democratic rather than fascist in character, and it abandoned the racial theories and anti-Semitism of the earlier Nazi propaganda. Liberation, in the United States' hands, was billed as the fulfillment of America's own revolutionary heritage of resistance to tyranny. By the way, I would interject that I would take that with a grain of salt. Unfortunately, although the rhetoric may have remained, quote, democratic, unquote, the realities did not. Continuing, it is useful to look at the gradual evolution of how these changes took place. The political rhetoric of the extremist exile groups that had once worked for the Nazis also evolved in a complex interaction with the gradual introduction of liberationist thinking into America. By the late 1940s, exiled extremist leaders had learned the rhetoric of this new, more, quote, American, unquote, form of liberation. Their adoption of lip service to democracy began to provide former fascists with a platform to promote their agenda to millions of Americans, and it created a shelter, in effect, that protected them from the exposure of their Nazi pasts. They were no longer seen as the triggermen of Nazi genocide in the public mind, but rather as fervent, anti-communist patriots. The government's intelligence agencies played a substantial role in this shift. And I would add, it is under the auspices of those agencies that the petroleum industry, intelligence community, American far right, and Galen link that we have been looking at this evening was formed. The changes in the rhetoric of the extreme Russian nationalist organization Nationalsotrudvoy Soyuz, or NTS, which is still active in today's Russian emigration, are a case in point. Recall, we've taken a look at the NTS at great length this evening. Continuing with Simpson's text, this once openly fascist group was founded in the early 1930s by a congress of younger Russian exiles who had fled their homeland in the wake of the 1917 revolution. During the first decade of its existence, the NTS proclaimed the Nazis as models. NTS members were contemptuous of any sort of democratic norms and of the United States, which they viewed as degenerate. Their party program called for an anti-communist revolution in the USSR, assassination of Soviet leaders, disenfranchisement of Jews, and confiscation of Jewish property. When the war broke out, the NTS unhesitatingly rallied to the cause of Nazi Germany. NTS strategy during the conflict, now this is during World War II, beginning again, NTS strategy during the conflict centered on an attempt to convince the Germans to sponsor its members as the new rulers of a puppet state inside the Nazi-occupied zone of the USSR. They gradually became a central part of the Germans' Vlasov Army political warfare project, serving as political officers and informers among the Eastern European troops who had defected to the Nazis. By the way, Vlasov only has one S. There's a misprint in the Scott text. Continuing. As a declassified U.S. State Department study on the group puts it, the NTS, quote, served in the good graces of the Germans, and it placed its men into the Kriegsgefangenenkommissionen, that's spelled Kriegsgefangenenkommissionen, beginning again. As a declassified U.S. State Department study on the group puts it, the NTS, quote, served in the good graces of the German, and it placed its men into the Kriegsgefangenenkommissionen, part of the Nazi prisoner of war camp administration frequently used for interrogation and recruitment of defectors, into the special camps for politically reliable prisoners, and above all, into the propagandist schools at Wüstgrau and Dabendorf, D-A-B-E-N-D-O-R-F, as well as into the Goebbels Anti-Comintern, unquote, a Nazi-sponsored alliance of fascist parties from around the world. Again quoting, graduates of the NTS training program, the study continues, were assigned to positions in German-occupied Russia, such as chiefs of police, deputy mayors, and propagandists with army units. Interrupting, of course, we've taken a look at not only the Anti-Comintern, but its reconstituted elements inside in the WACCFL. What we're going to look at next is how the NTS program developed under the auspices of Third Reich, in particular, its methodology developed as part of the Third Reich's covert operation and psychological and political warfare policy reached its fruition as a result of the incorporation of NTS and other elements of the Galen-ABN axis into the U.S. intelligence system, and as we've seen, it was the introduction of these elements into mainstream American political life which permitted the formation of the axis that we've been looking at tonight. Continuing. Many of the NTS leaders of the 1950s particularly those who served as police and city administrators in the Nazi occupation zone, are major war criminals who personally helped organize the identification, roundup, and execution of millions of Jewish and Slavic citizens. Insofar as NTS men won control of local administrations in the Nazi-occupied regions of the USSR, the organization became an integral part of the Nazis' propaganda, espionage, and extermination apparatus in the East. The main theme of NTS propaganda throughout the Second World War was a campaign to, quote, liberate, unquote, the USSR from Stalin, communism, and the Jews through a mutiny by the Red Army. The last sentence again, because we can see in the abortive 1991 coup a realization of these goals developed by NTS under Third Reich auspices and then carried forth into the Cold War period as a result of the injection of these elements into the U.S. national security establishment, and through their injection into the national security establishment, their projection into mainstream American political life. That sentence again. The main theme of NTS propaganda throughout the Second World War was a campaign to, quote, liberate, unquote, the USSR from Stalin, communism, and the Jews through a mutiny by the Red Army. This became the centerpiece of Vlasov Army recruiting efforts at least as early as 1942, and was elaborated in considerable detail with tactics for counterinsurgency operations in the Nazi occupation zone, behind-the-lines infiltration of NTS agents on espionage and sabotage missions, propaganda themes tailored to appeal to Russian sensibilities, and similar specifics. When the Germans were finally driven out of Russia, selected NTS agents were left on, quote, stay-behind, unquote, missions in an attempt to organize subversion in Soviet rear areas once the Red Army front had passed. The NTS also served as the dominant force after the Nazis themselves, and the Russkaya Osvobitel, that's O-S-V-O, it's R-U-S-S-K-A-J-A, O-S-V-O-B-O-D-I-T-E-L, Naya Armaya, the Russian Army of Liberation, or Vlasov Army, and the Komitet Osvobozhenaya, Narodov Rossai, German-sponsored Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, the Nazis' primary front group for Eastern Front political warfare operations in the desperate closing months of the war. That by the way, those are spelled R-U-S-S-K-A-G-A, O-S-V-O-B-O-D-I-T-L, N-A-I-A, A-R-M-I-I-A, and K-O-M-I-T-E-T, O-Z-V-O-B-O-Z-H-D-E-N-I-I-A, N-A-R-O-D-O-V, R-O-S-S-I. It was through the NTS and through the rival National Liberation Program sponsored among Soviet minority groups by the Nazis' Rosenberg Ministry that the strategy and tactics of the liberation of the USSR were first hammered out. These were the laboratories, so to speak, used by Hans Heinrich Herwarth, H-E-R-W-A-R-T-H, Gustav Hilger, H-I-L-G-E-R, and the other German political warfare officers discussed earlier to develop the propaganda themes and behind-the-lines subversion tactics believed most suitable for reaching people inside the USSR. Well, again, we looked at, during the course of the broadcast this evening, the tactical and methodological operational principles of the NTS, which, as we've seen here, were developed as a major component of the Third Reich's covert action and psychological and political warfare operations. And specifically, the centerpiece of NTS tactical methodology was to overthrow communism inside the USSR by promoting a mutiny in the Red Army. Now, it is, I think, relatively easy to see the fulfillment of this tactical and operational approach with the mutiny of the Soviet Army in the August 1991 coup, in which they literally mutinied against the hardline communist leaders who were attempting to overthrow Gorbachev. After the coup, I observed that, in all probability, the reason for the failed coup was that the Soviets were deeply infiltrated, that if I could sit and predict that such a coup would happen as a result of U.S. covert operations inside of the Soviet Union, which I went into in Radio Free America 36, the U.S. intelligence apparatus and those of other countries with their infinitely greater capabilities would have been able to anticipate and infiltrate that coup, and indeed some of the addenda to Radio Free America 36 have made it fairly clear that in fact that is what happened. Now I would note that just as the final overthrow of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union was effected through a realization of the methodology of the NTS, one of the Russian émigré groups that, again, was cultivated under the auspices of the Third Reich, and whose tactics were cultivated under the auspices of the Third Reich, it then jumped to the U.S. intelligence system, and these émigré groups were projected into American political life, and that is a result of the operations of CIA domestic organizations, and it was their projection into American political life which permitted the formation of the Petroleum Intelligence American Right-Wing Galen Axis, which we've been focusing on this evening. Bear in mind that the coup happened while George Bush, former director of the CIA, was President of the United States, and in a miscellaneous archive show done in September of 1988 entitled Nazis and Anti-Semites on the Bush Campaign, we took a look at many of these same Galen-ABN-related elements on the presence of them on the Republican Ethnic Heritage Council, including, among others, Laszlo Pastor, the veteran of the Hungarian Arrow Cross organization who became the director of Eastern European activities for the Free Congress Foundation, deeply linked not only to the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, but also to Boris Yeltsin. Now, the NTS methodology of promoting a mutiny by the Red Army was realized under George Bush in 1991, but the goals that were achieved as a result of the successful use of this methodology were those of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations, a rival Soviet émigré group which also worked for Galen and for U.S. intelligence and was involved with the axis that we've been looking at this evening, involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. Again, in the newly independent Ukraine, we have the RUK organization, which evolved directly from Stefan Bandera of the OUN-UPA, whom we've looked at this evening. And in the Russian Republic, again, we have Boris Yeltsin, very close to the Free Congress Foundation, in turn deeply linked with the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations. Related elements are also ascendant in the Baltic states. So what we have seen in 1991 is, again, the use of the NTS methodology of infiltrating and turning the Soviet Army and the realization of the anti-Bolshevik bloc of nations' goals of fragmenting the former Soviet Union into its constituent ethnic republics. And in opposition to that, I will begin winding the broadcast up this evening by reading an article from the Los Angeles Times of Saturday, August 1st of 1992. This is a Reuters story. Headline, Soviets lost secret war, in quotes, ex-spy says. Subheaded, Russia. The former head of intelligence compliments German, French, and U.S. opponents. Its dateline, Moscow. And it reads in part, the Soviet Union's last KGB spy master acknowledged Friday that Moscow had lost the, quote, secret war, unquote, of espionage and paid tribute to German, French, and U.S. opponents. Leonid Shebarshin, S-H-E-B-A-R-S-H-I-N, dismissed as head of the KGB's intelligence section after last August's failed coup, said Russians who had spied for Washington were driven by, quote, boundless selfishness and egoism compounded by absence of any strength of will, unquote. Again quoting, these people betrayed us, they will betray America, unquote, he told Komsomolskaya Pravda newspaper, that's K-O-M-S-O-M-O-L-S-K-A-Y-A, Pravda newspaper. Continuing, Shebarshin, head of overseas intelligence for more than 2 years until sacked by former President Mikhail S. Gorbachev, said he regretted the huge cost of the East-West Cold War. Quote, the secret war was a component of the Cold War. Our side lost that war, unquote, he said. Quote, I hope we draw lessons from that, unquote. And skipping down and again quoting, I would rank both German services among those deserving of special respect, Section 1 of the East German Secret Service, which no longer exists, and West Germany's BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, as well as the French, unquote, he said. He said that from a professional point of view, the Iraqis and Israelis had also performed well. Again quoting, The United States CIA deserves special mention, enormous money, enormous scope, enormous drive. That brings results, unquote, he said. Well, of course, the BND, as we know, is the final incarnation of the Galen Organization, and the CIA obviously is inextricably linked with the Galen Organization, as we have seen in so many different broadcasts. And as the former head of the KGB has noted, the Soviet Union lost that secret war. We've been looking at that secret war, and the decisive element in that secret war was when the United States also lost its own secret war, that when the elements that we've been looking at this evening successfully overthrew the legitimate constitutional representative, namely President Kennedy. The assassination of John Kennedy was not only a military coup, but a fascist coup. It represented, as I've said, the resolution of a decades-old conflict between the military and the executive branch. The military has long chafed at the idea of having a civilian commander-in-chief. It represented the triumph of rollback or liberation theory of fighting the Cold War, with its genesis in the Galen group that we've seen, over containment theory, and it also represented the coming of fascism to America. We will be looking at that in weeks to come. The last item in tonight's broadcast will be a very short section from another article in Covert Action Information Bulletin number 41 from the summer of 1992. This particular article is called The U.S. Economy, The Enemy Within. It's authored by Doug Henwood, Henwood, and skipping well down into this particular article, we're going to read a short section which illustrates how the prosecution of the Cold War and the triumph of the elements that we have been examining this evening, and we will continue to examine in the rest of Radio Free America 37, how they represent the culmination of the Third Reich's geopolitical goals, and these goals having been realized through the United States. Henwood writes, militarily, the U.S. is coasting on its superpower reputation, but when it comes to cash, the U.S. repeatedly comes up short. Larger military adventures now require foreign approval and foreign cash. Financial limitations have also forced Washington into a secondary role into the restructuring of the former socialist world. Although U.S. policy in large measure did in the Reds, German firms will probably make most of the profits picking over the remains. And as we've seen, U.S. policy stemmed directly from Third Reich policy. That is the full-court press strategy described by Sean Gervasi in Radio Free America programs 35 and 39. It bankrupted the Soviet Union, all right, but it also bankrupted us, and some of the implications of that we will be looking at in weeks to come as we develop Radio Free America program number 37, How the United States Lost the Second World War.